Welcome, dear listener. You've entered Audible Archives, a sanctuary of sound where lost tales awaken, your guide through these ancient echoes and timeless legends. So lean back, breathe deep, and let the story begin. This is Audible Archives, where every word holds a whisper of magic. Welcome to Audible Archives. I'm Raul, your writer, host, and guide into a world of shadows, sharp minds, and unsolved crimes. In this original series, meet Detective S.R.H, a name whispered in precincts and feared in underworld alleys. Brilliant, relentless, and always one step ahead. This is episode 1 of Detective S.R.H, Case 1 to 5. The case is open. Let's begin.
Case 1. The Shrieks on Blackthorn Alley. The heavy scent of rain lingered in the air as Stephen Raul Hughes stepped out of the cab, his coat collar turned up against the biting chill of the evening. Blackthorn Alley was a place of whispered warnings and avoided glances, a narrow, cobbled stretch buried in the underbelly of the city. Tonight, the shadows seemed deeper, the silence heavier, broken only by the occasional drip of water from rusted pipes. Stephen lit a cigarette, letting the first drag settle his nerves. Charming spot, he muttered dryly as a rat skittered across his path. His sharp eyes took in the scene, a growing crowd of gawkers held back by 2 uniformed constables, their faces pale in the flickering gaslight. "Detective Hughes," a voice called. A younger officer approached, his expression a mix of relief and unease. "Glad you're here, sir. This one's strange." Stephen exhaled a thin plume of smoke. "Strange is what keeps me in business, Officer Grayson. What do we have?" Grayson gestured to the decrepit 3-story building behind him. Its windows were dark, save for one on the second floor where faint lamplight flickered. "The scream started about an hour ago. Neighbors say it sounded like someone being, well, torn apart. When we got here, the door to the apartment was locked from the inside. We had to break it down." "And inside?" Stephen asked, already anticipating the answer. Grayson swallowed hard. 2 victims. One of them, the old landlady, Mrs. Eliza Cartwright. The other's her tenant, Miss Rose Whitaker. Both dead. No sign of forced entry, but the place is wrecked, like a hurricane hit it. Stephen flicked the ash from his cigarette, his mind already racing. "And the neighbors? Did they see anyone?" "Not a soul. Just heard the screams, then silence. The thing is," Grayson hesitated, "they claim they heard voices. 2 of them. One was the landlady, but the other, they say it didn't sound human." Stephen raised an eyebrow but said nothing. He took a final drag from his cigarette and dropped it, crushing the ember underfoot. "Show me." As he followed Grayson into the building, the stench of blood hit him before he even reached the apartment door. Inside, the dim lamplight cast long shadows over a scene that made even Stephen pause. The apartment was chaos, furniture overturned, the walls gouged with deep scratches, and in the center of it all lay Rose Whitaker, her body twisted unnaturally. Across the room, the fireplace yawned dark and empty, save for the faint smell of burnt wood. "Where's the other victim?" Stephen asked, his voice steady. Grayson pointed to the chimney. "Up there, sir. Took us 10 minutes to get her out." Stephen knelt by the hearth, peering inside. The blackened bricks were smeared with soot and blood. It didn't make sense. None of it did. Standing, he surveyed the room again. His gaze landed on a small object near Rose's hand, something out of place amidst the destruction. He picked it up with a gloved hand, a tuft of coarse, golden brown hair. Strange, he murmured to himself. Sir? Grayson asked. Stephen tucked the tuft into an evidence bag. Nothing. Let's just say I have a feeling this one's going to be memorable. To Stephen, the locked door mysteries were always the most intriguing. But this one felt different. There was a whisper of something beyond the ordinary in the air, a reminder that the world often held more questions than answers. And questions, Stephen knew, were always worth chasing. The morning sun barely pierced through the grime-covered windows of the station's forensics room. Stephen sat at a worn wooden table, staring at the tuft of golden brown hair sealed in its evidence bag. The night's events played over in his mind, the locked door, the grotesque state of the victims, the unnatural scratches on the walls. Grayson entered, carrying a steaming cup of coffee. You've been here all night, sir? Stephen didn't look up. Sleep is for the innocent, Officer Grayson. We, unfortunately, are guilty of chasing the truth. He reached for the coffee. Any luck with the neighbors? Grayson sighed, sinking into a chair opposite him. Not much. The only consistent detail is the voices. One of them was shrill, panicked, Mrs. Cartwright, probably. But the other, they all described it differently. One said it was guttural, like an animal growling. Another said it was high-pitched, almost a scream. No one agrees. Stephen nodded thoughtfully, tapping a cigarette against the table. And what about the hair? Lab's running tests, but initial analysis says it's not human. They're trying to match it to local fauna. Stephen lit his cigarette and leaned back, exhaling a thin stream of smoke. Not human, yet it was in a locked room where two humans were murdered. Interesting. Grayson shifted uncomfortably. There's something else, sir. One of the neighbors mentioned seeing something a few days ago, a man unloading crates into the alley late at night. She said she thought it was smuggled liquor or something. Stephen's eyes narrowed. Crates, you say? And no one thought that detail worth mentioning until now? Grayson shrugged. You know how it is in this part of town. People mind their own business unless it screams bloody murder. Stephen stubbed out his cigarette, his thoughts clicking into place. Smuggling, strange hair, and the locked room, all disparate pieces that didn't yet form a whole. Grayson, we're going back to Blackthorn Alley, Stephen said, grabbing his coat. The alley was eerily quiet under the gray sky. Stephen and Grayson made their way to the apartment building, where the crime scene remained undisturbed. Inside, Stephen's eyes scanned the wreckage with renewed focus. Did anyone check the roof? He asked suddenly. Grayson blinked. The roof? Why would? Stephen was already moving. Because we've been too focused on what's inside. Sometimes, the key to understanding a mystery is in the details we overlook. The creaky wooden stairs led them to the rooftop, where Stephen paused, taking in the view. The flat surface was covered in grime, but something caught his eye, faint scuff marks near the edge, leading toward a drain pipe. Someone, or something, climbed up here, Stephen murmured. Grayson frowned. You think the killer came in through the roof? Stephen crouched, running his fingers over the scuff marks. Possibly. Or perhaps they left this way. As he stood, his gaze drifted to a pile of discarded crates in the neighboring alley. He motioned for Grayson to follow. Down below, the crates were splintered and damp, their wooden sides stamped with a foreign shipping label. Stephen tore a piece of the label free, examining it closely. "Delacroix Imports," he read aloud. "They deal in rare goods, exotic animals, I believe." Grayson's face paled. "You think an animal did this?" Stephen didn't answer immediately. Instead, he pocketed the label and straightened, his mind racing. "Let's not jump to conclusions, Officer Grayson. But let's also consider that not all killers need a conscience to strike." He lit another cigarette and took a long drag, watching the smoke swirl into the chilly air. Somewhere in these streets, he was certain, was the answer. Back at the station, Stephen leaned against his desk, the Delacroix Imports label spread out before him. He had just finished writing down a name, a contact at the import company who could shed some light on the crates. But before he could leave, a man in a tattered coat burst through the door, shouting incoherently. "You gotta listen. You gotta believe me," the man cried, his eyes wide with desperation. Two officers restrained him as he struggled. Stephen stood and approached calmly, his sharp gaze cutting through the chaos. "Let him speak," he said, motioning for the officers to release their grip. The man took a trembling step forward, wringing his hands. I saw it. I saw what happened that night in the alley." Stephen's eyes narrowed. "Go on." The man licked his lips nervously. "I was hiding, okay? Didn't want no trouble, but I heard the screams, so I looked up. Saw something moving on the walls, climbing like it didn't care gravity existed. Big. Fast. Not human. Not human," Stephen repeated, his voice flat. "And you're just now coming forward?" The man flinched. "I didn't want to get involved. But now everyone's talking about it, and I don't want it coming after me." Stephen tilted his head slightly, his tone laced with dry sarcasm. "So, out of fear for your life, you came to the police station. Brilliant strategy." The man didn't respond, his fear too great. Stephen gestured to an officer. "Get his statement. Every detail, no matter how absurd." As the man was led away, Grayson approached, his expression grim. "Sir, we've got another problem. Word's spreading about this case. Some of the neighbors are already talking about curses and demons. It's spooking people." Stephen pinched the bridge of his nose. "The last thing we need is a mob fueled by fear and superstition." He grabbed his coat. "Let's see what Delacroix Imports has to say." Delacroix Imports was housed in a dimly lit warehouse on the outskirts of town. The air smelled of damp wood and exotic spices, and the distant sound of crates being moved echoed through the vast space. A wiry man in a tailored suit greeted them with a practiced smile. "Detective Hughes, I presume? My name is Vincent Delacroix. How can I assist you?" Stephen held up the shipping label. "One of your crates was found near the scene of a double homicide in Blackthorn Alley. I'm here to find out what was in it." Delacroix's smile faltered. I assure you, Detective, our business is entirely legitimate. We import rare artifacts, spices, and occasionally live specimens for zoos or private collectors." "Live specimens," Stephen repeated, his tone sharp. "Such as?" Delacroix hesitated. "Exotic animals, birds, reptiles, primates." Stephen's expression didn't change, but his mind raced. "And recently? What's been shipped in?" Delacroix shifted uncomfortably. "We did receive a shipment of a rare primate species, a large orangutan." It was destined for a collector, but what? Stephen pressed. It escaped, Delacroix admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. A week ago. We've been trying to recapture it ever since. These animals are valuable, Detective. We would never. Save your justifications, Stephen interrupted. If this orangutan was roaming the city, how dangerous would it be? Delacroix spread his hands. It's not inherently violent, but if it felt threatened or cornered, it could act unpredictably. They're incredibly strong enough to, he trailed off, realizing the implication. Stephen stepped closer, his voice low and cold. You knew it was loose, and yet you said nothing. 2 women are dead because of your negligence, Mr. Delacroix. I suggest you cooperate fully before this becomes more than a conversation. Delacroix swallowed hard and nodded. As Stephen and Grayson left the warehouse, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the city. Grayson glanced at Stephen. So, what now? Do we hunt this thing down? Stephen lit a cigarette, the flame illuminating his thoughtful expression. Not yet. Something still doesn't fit. What do you mean? Stephen exhaled a plume of smoke. If the orangutan is responsible, why the voices? Why the locked door? And why do I feel like Delacroix knows more than he's letting on? Grayson frowned. You think he's lying? Stephen smirked faintly. Let's just say I wouldn't bet my paycheck on his honesty. As they walked into the encroaching darkness, Stephen's mind churned with possibilities. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fall into place, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the true picture was far more disturbing than anyone realized. The soft hiss of rain against the station windows was the only sound as Stephen sat at his desk, the case files spread out before him. His cigarette burned low, the ash teetering precariously. He'd been combing through the evidence for hours, his sharp mind refusing to let go of the inconsistencies. Delacroix's confession about the orangutan fit too neatly. The locked door, the voices, the sheer violence of the scene, something still felt off. Sir, Grayson's voice broke the silence as he entered the room, holding a folder. Lab results just came in. Stephen reached for it, scanning the contents. The coarse hair they'd found was confirmed to belong to a primate, but there was something else, traces of a strange resin on the fur, as well as on the victim's wounds. Resin? Stephen murmured, his mind turning. He flipped through his mental catalog of knowledge, piecing together possibilities. Yes, sir, Grayson said. The lab thinks it's sap from a rare tree. Said it's not native to this area, comes from South America. Same region as orangutans, apparently. Stephen leaned back, the pieces clicking into place. Delacroix wasn't just smuggling animals, he was dealing in illegal plants and substances, too. But that still didn't explain the locked room or the voices. Grayson, bring me the neighbor's statements again, Stephen ordered. Grayson retrieved the documents, spreading them across the desk. Stephen studied them, his photographic memory recalling each detail. The witnesses had all described hearing voices, one shrill and human, the other guttural and incomprehensible. Most importantly, one witness had mentioned seeing something strange on the building's roof, a shadowy figure dragging something heavy toward the chimney. The roof, Stephen muttered, his gaze sharpening. Minutes later, Stephen and Grayson were back at the crime scene, climbing the stairs to the rooftop. The rain had stopped, leaving the city slick and gleaming under the pale moonlight. Stephen crouched near the chimney, examining the scuff marks he'd noticed earlier. This time, he spotted something else, fragments of dried resin, stuck to the edge of the chimney. It used the chimney, Stephen said, more to himself than to Grayson. What did? Grayson asked. Stephen stood, his mind racing. The orangutan, or rather, someone using it. Grayson's brow furrowed. You're saying someone trained this thing to kill? Stephen shook his head. Not trained. Manipulated. The resin, it's from a hallucinogenic plant. If Delacroix or someone in his operation exposed the orangutan to it, it could have driven the creature into a frenzy, making it violent and unpredictable. Grayson looked horrified. You think Delacroix planned this? Stephen lit a cigarette, taking a long drag. Not necessarily the murders. But he knew what he was dealing with. He knew the risks, and he covered it up to protect his business. Then why the locked door? Grayson pressed. Stephen exhaled slowly, his gaze distant. To frame the scene, make it look like an impossible crime. The voices were a byproduct of the orangutan's confusion and distress. The scratches on the walls, the overturned furniture, it's all the result of panic. Grayson nodded slowly, the theory settling into place. So, what's our next move? Stephen glanced at the warehouse in the distance, its shadow looming like a specter over the city. We paid Delacroix another visit. This time, Stephen didn't knock. He and Grayson pushed through the warehouse doors, their boots echoing on the cold concrete. Delacroix was in the middle of a transaction, his face twisting into a mask of feigned surprise. Detective Hughes, he began, but Stephen cut him off. Save it, Stephen said, holding up the resin-stained evidence bag. You lied to me, Delacroix. The orangutan didn't just escape, did it? You knew exactly what it was capable of because you made it that way. Delacroix's composure faltered, his eyes darting toward the back of the warehouse. Don't even think about it, Grayson warned, stepping forward. Delacroix sighed, his shoulders sagging. Fine. Yes, I knew. The animal was unstable. But I didn't kill those women. I swear, I didn't mean for it to happen. Stephen's eyes narrowed. You didn't mean for it to happen, but you didn't stop it either. And then you tried to cover it up, locking the door to confuse the investigation and protect your operation. Delacroix opened his mouth to protest, but Stephen silenced him with a sharp glare. 2 women are dead because of your greed, Delacroix. You'll answer for that. As Delacroix was taken into custody, Stephen stood outside the warehouse, the night air heavy with the scent of rain and tobacco smoke. Grayson joined him, looking weary but satisfied. Good work, sir, Grayson said. Stephen gave a faint smile, though his mind was elsewhere. This case was closed, but the charred scrap of paper he'd found in the apartment still nagged at him. The symbols etched into it were eerily familiar, stirring memories he couldn't quite place. Lighting another cigarette, Stephen stared into the darkness, his thoughts drifting to his wife. He could almost hear her laugh, soft and melodic, a sound he longed to hear again. The truth always comes at a price, he muttered, his words carried away by the night. The next morning, the city's papers were already buzzing with the story. Detective Hughes solves Blackthorn mystery, exotic animal smuggling ring exposed. It was a neat headline, the kind that would satisfy the public's curiosity without revealing the more grotesque details of the case. Stephen sat at his desk, reviewing the final report. The orangutan was now in the custody of a local zoo, tranquilized and unharmed. Delacroix was behind bars, facing multiple charges: reckless endangerment, smuggling, and obstruction of justice. The case was tied up, at least on the surface. Yet, Stephen couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something had been missed. He pulled out the charred scrap of paper he'd found in the victim's apartment. The symbols etched into its surface were crude, almost ritualistic. Grayson entered, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Thought you might need this," he said, setting one down. Stephen nodded his thanks but didn't look up from the paper. "Did the lab find anything on this?" Grayson shook his head. "It's just ash, sir. Probably a burnt piece of parchment or something." "Parchment," Stephen repeated, his voice thoughtful. He turned the scrap over, his photographic memory working in overdrive. The symbols triggered something buried deep, a memory from a case years ago, a report he'd read about obscure cults and their rituals. "Grayson, do me a favor," Stephen said, standing abruptly. "Check the victims' backgrounds again. I want to know if either of them had any connection to esoteric groups or unusual activities." Grayson frowned but nodded. "You think this wasn't just an accident?" Stephen's gaze hardened. "I think Delacroix might have been a pawn in a larger game. And if I'm right, this won't be the last time we hear about those symbols." Later that evening, Stephen walked the streets alone, the chill of the night air biting through his coat. His cigarette glowed faintly as he made his way to Blackthorn Alley one last time. The crime scene was still blocked off, but the faint echoes of the past lingered. He stood in the doorway of the apartment, staring at the broken furniture, the bloodstains now dried and dark. He could hear the laughter of the officers as they celebrated at the station, their camaraderie a brief escape from the darkness they faced every day. Stephen, however, felt no joy. Instead, he thought of her, his wife, her laugh, and how it used to brighten his world. The ash in his hand crumbled as he stared at the symbols again. They reminded him of the day she died, the flames consuming everything he loved. There had been no answers then, only whispers of something unexplainable. "Another case solved," he muttered, his voice hollow. "And another question left unanswered." The faint echo of his wife's laugh played in his mind, fragile and fleeting, like the ember of his cigarette. Stephen turned and walked away, the weight of the mystery settling deeper into his soul. The case of Blackthorn Alley was closed, but the clues it left behind whispered of something far greater, a truth Stephen would not stop chasing, no matter the cost. Case 2, The Death of Evelyn Harper. The steady patter of rain against the windows added an eerie rhythm to the somber atmosphere inside the Harper mansion. The house, a sprawling estate nestled in the countryside, had always been a symbol of wealth and respectability. But tonight, it was a crime scene, a silent witness to an unspeakable tragedy. Stephen Raul Hughes stood at the threshold of the study, his cigarette glowing faintly in the dim light. His sharp eyes scanned the room with practiced precision. The scene seemed almost too perfect, too tidy, to be real. Evelyn Harper sat slumped at her desk, her hand still clutching a revolver, the cold metal of the gun reflecting the faint light from the lamp beside her. A letter lay on the desk, the words barely visible through the pool of blood. At first glance, the scene screamed suicide. There were no signs of struggle, no forced entry. The revolver, a personal possession of Evelyn's, was right there, where it should have been, resting in her grasp. The letter, signed by Evelyn, seemed to confirm the cause of death, financial troubles, an impossible situation. She had been overwhelmed and had taken her life. But Stephen, ever the skeptic, knew better than to trust the surface appearance. There was something about this room, about Evelyn's death, that felt off, something that didn't quite add up. "Detective Hughes," a voice called from the doorway, breaking his concentration. It was Officer Grayson, his loyal assistant, looking concerned as he stepped into the room. "I trust you've seen the letter," Grayson said, motioning to the desk. Stephen didn't respond immediately. His gaze remained fixed on the scene, studying the details. The positioning of the body, the lack of struggle, the way the letter seemed too neatly placed for someone in distress, it all seemed rehearsed. Too rehearsed. "Yes, I've read it," Stephen finally said, his voice low. He flicked the ash from his cigarette, eyes still scanning. "And I don't believe it for a second." Grayson's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Stephen pushed himself away from the desk and began pacing around the room, his mind working through the possibilities. The letter's too convenient. Too clean. If she had truly been at her wit's end, don't you think she would have been a bit more emotional? The letter's impersonal, detached. And the revolver, he paused, turning to face Grayson. It's positioned too perfectly in her hand. No one holds a weapon like that in their final moments unless it's placed that way intentionally. Grayson looked between Stephen and the body, his skepticism slowly giving way to curiosity. "So, you think it's murder?" "I think it's something else," Stephen said, his gaze shifting toward the window, where the rain continued to fall. "Someone's trying to make it look like a suicide, but they missed a few crucial details." Grayson stepped closer to the desk, picking up the letter. "But what about the financial troubles? I heard Harper was in some deep debt. Maybe Evelyn just couldn't take it anymore." Stephen's eyes narrowed. "That's what they want you to believe. The people close to her, the ones who stand to gain the most from her death, are quick to push this narrative. But I don't buy it. Not yet." He walked toward the window, gazing out at the estate's sprawling grounds. The mansion, beautiful on the outside, felt cold and hollow to him now. He could already sense that the Harper family's secrets ran deep. "There's more to this, Grayson." "Much more," Stephen muttered, flicking the cigarette away. "Someone's hiding something." The investigation was just beginning, but Stephen knew that in cases like these, the truth often lay beneath the surface, hidden in the shadows, waiting for the right person to uncover it. He turned back to the room, his eyes lingering on Evelyn's body one last time. There was no sign of struggle, no sign of self-inflicted harm, nothing that made sense for someone who supposedly had nothing left to live for. "Start with the family," Stephen instructed, turning back to Grayson. "Get me everything on Evelyn's husband, Richard, and her brother, George. The motive is usually in the family. If we dig deep enough, we'll find it." Grayson nodded, but Stephen could tell he wasn't convinced. He understood. After all, the first impression this scene gave was too clean, too neat, to suggest anything more than a tragic, if predictable, end. But Stephen knew better. As he stepped out of the study and into the rain-soaked night, he could feel the weight of the mystery settling in. The first few steps of the investigation were always the hardest, the clues elusive, the suspects reluctant to reveal their true natures. But Stephen Raul Hughes had never been one to back down from a challenge. In this case, the truth was buried beneath a web of lies, and it would take everything Stephen had to untangle it. The next morning, Stephen sat at his desk, the early light barely filtering through the blinds. His cigarette burned slowly, its ash accumulating in the tray as he sifted through the case file. Grayson had returned from interviewing the household staff, but the details were underwhelming. No one had seen anything unusual. Evelyn had been in good spirits the night before her death, according to the maid. She'd been reading in her study, occasionally writing notes on a legal pad, until late into the night. Stephen leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the edge of the desk. Good spirits? It didn't match the desperate tone of the suicide letter. Everything about the scene seemed designed to fit a narrative, but that wasn't enough. There were too many gaps. Grayson, Stephen called, without turning around. Grayson entered the room, holding a folder with fresh information. I've spoken to both Richard Harper and his brother, George. They're eager to cooperate, but something feels off. He handed over the folder. Here's what I've got. Stephen flipped through the documents, his eyes scanning the basic details. Richard Harper, the wealthy businessman, had a spotless public record. Married to Evelyn for 10 years, they had no children but seemed to have enjoyed a stable, albeit distant, relationship. Financially, the Harpers were far from bankrupt, but there were rumors, whispers of poor investments in risky ventures. The kind of trouble that might push a person toward the unthinkable. George Harper, the estranged brother, was another story. He'd been out of contact with the family for years, living abroad in a variety of places, Paris, London, and more recently, Milan. His return to the country had been sudden and unexpected, just weeks before Evelyn's death. According to Richard, George had been trying to re-establish a connection with his sister, but there was no real evidence to support that claim. Stephen flicked through the rest of the folder, his expression hardening. The financial troubles of the Harper family were real, but they weren't insurmountable. Something didn't sit right with him. Why would Evelyn, with all the resources at her disposal, choose to take her life? She had options, therapy, support from her husband, perhaps even a way out of the financial mess. Yet, the more Stephen looked, the more the suicide narrative fell apart. You said George is here now? Stephen asked, his voice cold and calculating. Grayson nodded. He's waiting downstairs. Richard suggested we speak with him next. Good. I'll talk to him, Stephen said, standing and tossing his cigarette into the ashtray. The Harper estate was quiet as they descended the grand staircase. George Harper was seated in the study, a large armchair casting a long shadow over his brooding figure. He was younger than Richard by several years, with sharp features and an air of aloofness that suggested he wasn't accustomed to being questioned by anyone, let alone a detective. Mr. Harper, Stephen greeted him, offering a polite nod. I understand you've recently returned to the country. I'd like to ask you a few questions about your sister. George glanced up, his eyes narrowing slightly, though his voice remained measured. I told the officers everything I know about Evelyn. What more is there to say? Stephen took a seat across from him, his gaze unwavering. It's come to my attention that your sister was having some difficulties, financially, personally. You were in touch with her recently, correct? George's lips tightened into a thin line. We had some discussions, yes. She wanted to put the past behind her. We disagreed about some things, but that's normal between siblings, isn't it? Stephen studied him, sensing the underlying tension. There was a lot unsaid in those words. And what about the night of her death? Where were you? George hesitated, his fingers drumming against the arm of the chair. I was at my hotel. Alone. I didn't see Evelyn that evening. Did you know that Evelyn was struggling with debts? Your family had a reputation for business success, but it seems things weren't as rosy as they appeared, Stephen pressed. George stiffened, his eyes flashing with annoyance. That's private family business. If Evelyn had concerns, she should have spoken to Richard. Not me. Stephen leaned forward, his tone soft but piercing. But you're here now, aren't you? Back in the country after all these years. Coincidence? George's jaw clenched. I came back to make amends. To make peace with her before it was too late. That's all. Something about George's story didn't align with the evidence. The timing of his return, his coldness, the lack of any substantial relationship with Evelyn for years, all of it pointed toward a deeper involvement than he was willing to admit. Stephen stood up, his eyes locked on George's. I'll be in touch. Don't leave town. George said nothing as Stephen turned and walked toward the door. The tension in the room remained thick, as if George's carefully constructed walls had cracked, just slightly. Back in the hallway, Grayson was waiting for him. Well? He's hiding something. No doubt about it, Stephen replied, his voice calm but firm. Start looking into George's recent movements, his finances, his contacts. Everything. Grayson nodded and began walking toward the front door. I'll get right on it. Stephen lingered in the hallway for a moment, his thoughts turning to Richard Harper. The husband had an alibi, but there was still something unsettling about him. He wasn't the type to mourn openly, yet his behavior after Evelyn's death had been calculated, almost too perfect, like a man who had been preparing for this moment. Stephen's mind raced with possibilities. A family feud. Financial strain. A possible secret lover. Everyone had their secrets, and as Stephen dug deeper, he knew that the key to this case lay not in the obvious suspects, but in the tangled web of deceit they had all woven. The first thread had been pulled. Now, it was time to unravel the rest. The rain had not let up since the previous night, a steady downpour that seemed to mirror Stephen's growing sense of unease. He stood in front of the Harper estate, his trench coat fluttering in the wind, as he considered the next step in his investigation. George Harper's story was full of holes, but there was still Richard, the seemingly grief-stricken husband who had, so far, remained an enigma. Stephen had already formed his theory: Evelyn's death was no suicide. But what was the motive? Was it a crime of passion, an act of financial desperation, or something more sinister, hidden beneath the layers of family secrets? I'll speak to Richard, Stephen told Grayson, who had just pulled up in a police car. It's time to get some answers from him. Grayson nodded, his expression serious. You think he's involved? I think everyone's hiding something. But Richard, he's the most likely to crack under pressure. He's the type to keep his emotions tightly controlled. It's usually the ones who look perfect on the outside who are the most dangerous. Inside the mansion, Richard Harper sat in a lavishly decorated sitting room, his demeanor one of quiet sorrow. His eyes were red from what appeared to be hours of grieving, but his composure remained remarkably intact. He looked every bit the heartbroken husband, but to Stephen, it seemed rehearsed, a carefully constructed facade that didn't quite reach his eyes. Mr. Harper, Stephen began, his voice soft but authoritative, as he entered the room. I'd like to ask you a few questions about Evelyn's death. Richard looked up from the glass of whiskey he was nursing, his gaze cold and distant. I've already given my statement to the police. I don't know what more I can say. Stephen took a seat across from him, his gaze unwavering. I'm not here to relive the details of that night. I'm interested in what happened before. Evelyn's financial troubles. The strain in your marriage. Did you know about it? Richard stiffened, his jaw tightening imperceptibly. I knew things weren't perfect. But Evelyn, she was strong. She would have talked to me if there was a real problem. Stephen leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. But she didn't, did she? Not about everything. You see, I've spoken to your brother, George. He said he was trying to reconnect with Evelyn. That doesn't quite line up with the story you've been telling. Richard's eyes flickered, a brief moment of vulnerability flashing across his face before he masked it again with a calm demeanor. George and Evelyn had their differences. They were never close. But I don't see how that's relevant. I think it's very relevant, Stephen replied. Because George wasn't the only person who might have had a reason to get close to Evelyn before her death. Was there someone else, Richard? Someone who might have been in her life recently? Richard shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his fingers gripping the edge of his glass. I don't know what you're implying, Detective. Stephen allowed a long silence to hang in the air. Evelyn was having an affair, wasn't she? That's why she kept her troubles to herself. She didn't want you to know. Richard's eyes went wide for a split second, a crack in his composure. But just as quickly, he regained control, his expression turning icy. That's absurd. My wife would never. Don't lie to me, Stephen interrupted. You knew. She was seeing someone, wasn't she? Who was it, Richard? Was it someone close to you? For the first time, Richard's eyes betrayed a flicker of something, a hint of fear or perhaps guilt, but he quickly covered it with an angry glare. You don't know what you're talking about. Evelyn had her own life, and I had mine. But she was never unfaithful. Stephen didn't buy it. He knew the subtle tells, the way Richard's gaze avoided certain parts of the conversation, the way his grip tightened on the whiskey glass when the affair was mentioned. It was clear to Stephen that Richard had been hiding more than just financial troubles. Do you know who it was, then? Stephen pressed, his voice growing firmer. Who did she confide in, if not you? Richard's face remained stoic, but Stephen could see the shift. He was inching closer to the truth. No, Richard muttered, his voice quiet and defeated. I don't know. But I suspect you already do. Later that evening, Stephen found himself in the dimly lit office of the private investigator he had hired to look into Evelyn's life outside the marriage. The investigator, a grizzled man named Thomas Wren, had already gathered a small but telling piece of information. Evelyn had been meeting with a man, someone who had been visiting her under the guise of business meetings. But there was more to the story. Wren handed Stephen a set of photos, each one showing Evelyn with the same man. He was a businessman, older than Evelyn, but with a certain air of charm and authority that Stephen instantly recognized. The man's name was Alan Harris, and he was a former associate of Richard Harper. Interesting, Stephen muttered, studying the photos closely. Evelyn had been seeing someone from her husband's past, someone with whom she had likely shared more than just casual business talks. Stephen's mind raced. The affair wasn't just about infidelity, it was about motive. Alan Harris had reason to be in the picture. He had access to the Harpers, and with Richard's business dealings in trouble, he might have been looking for a way to secure his position, perhaps at any cost. But the bigger question remained, how did Harris fit into the puzzle of Evelyn's death? Had he killed her out of jealousy, or was there something else at play? Stephen could feel the pieces starting to fall into place. The financial problems. The affair. The tension between Richard and George. It all pointed in one direction, but there was still one more person who needed to be questioned. Alan Harris. "I need to find him," Stephen said, standing abruptly. Now. The night was heavy with a sense of impending revelation, the city streets slick from the rain as Stephen made his way through the dark alleyways of downtown. His mind was focused on one person, Alan Harris. The photos, the hidden meetings, the ties to Richard's past, they were all part of a story that hadn't been fully told yet. Stephen had arranged for Wren to dig deeper into Harris's background, but there was still a sense of urgency to find him, to confront him directly. The deeper Stephen delved, the more convinced he became that Harris wasn't just another affair partner, he was a key figure in the web of lies surrounding Evelyn's death. The address Wren had provided led him to an unassuming building tucked away behind a row of bars. A simple sign with Harris and Company. Consulting hung above the entrance, its letters worn and faded. Inside, the dim light of the office seemed to reflect the murkiness of the situation. Stephen knocked on the door. A moment passed before the door opened, revealing a man in his early 40s, sharply dressed in a dark suit, his posture immaculate, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of surprise when he saw Stephen. Alan Harris was exactly as Stephen had expected, composed, confident, and with a presence that spoke of someone used to dealing with delicate matters. "Mr. Harris, I presume?" Stephen's voice was cold, his demeanor steady. "Detective Stephen Hughes. I need to ask you a few questions about your relationship with Evelyn Harper." Harris's face remained calm, though there was an edge to his voice when he replied, "I don't know what you're talking about, Detective. Evelyn Harper was a client, nothing more." He stepped aside, motioning for Stephen to come in. "Please, come in. But I can assure you, I have nothing to hide." Stephen entered the office, his eyes scanning the room as he took a seat across from Harris. The office was neat, sparsely decorated, with only a few framed certificates and a small pile of paperwork on the desk. The air between them was thick with tension, the silence almost oppressive. "I've seen the photos, Mr. Harris," Stephen began, his voice clipped. "You and Evelyn met quite frequently over the past several months, despite your claims of a purely professional relationship." Harris stiffened, but he quickly masked the shift in his posture with a forced smile. "I don't know who's been feeding you this information, but I'll tell you now, Evelyn and I were friends. Yes, we had business dealings, but that's all. Nothing more." Stephen leaned forward, his gaze piercing. "I've also learned that your company has been struggling financially. In fact, it seems like you've been in some serious debt. Do you think Evelyn might have been helping you out with that?" Harris's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, but he quickly regained his composure. "I don't see how my personal finances have anything to do with Evelyn's tragic death. And yes, I did work with her on a few things. She had connections in the right places. But that's all. Did you know she was in financial trouble, Mr. Harris? Stephen continued, unfazed by Harris's attempt to deflect. She was struggling, deeply in debt. You don't strike me as the kind of person who'd let someone like her suffer. So why didn't you help her? The words hung in the air for a moment. Harris's eyes narrowed, his fingers drumming slowly on the desk. Stephen could feel the tension building, like a thread stretched taut, ready to snap. She was a client, Harris said, his voice growing cold. I don't owe her anything. I provided her with business opportunities, nothing more. Stephen pressed on. And yet, you were more than just a business associate, weren't you? Evelyn trusted you. She had to. Why else would she have kept your meetings secret? Why would she have hidden your relationship from her husband? Harris's gaze flickered for a brief moment, just long enough for Stephen to notice. This is ridiculous, he muttered, standing up abruptly. I've already told you everything I know. I was just trying to help her. Stephen didn't flinch, maintaining his calm. Did you? Help her, I mean. Because right now, I'm wondering if helping her was the last thing on your mind when you realized her death could clear up some of your own mess. You needed her money, didn't you? Harris's face twisted with a barely contained rage, but Stephen wasn't finished. You think Evelyn's death was a suicide, right? You think it was the financial pressure that drove her to take her own life. But you know, I don't buy it. I don't think she killed herself at all. I think she knew too much. I think you knew too much. And I think you were willing to go to any lengths to keep your little arrangement under wraps. For a long moment, the two men stared each other down, the air between them crackling with hostility. Then, Harris slowly exhaled, his shoulders slumping as if the fight had suddenly gone out of him. You're right, he admitted quietly. Evelyn did know too much. She was going to expose some things that would have ruined me. His eyes darkened. But I didn't kill her, Detective. I didn't need to. She made a choice, and it was her own. I just let her believe she had no other way out. Stephen's mind raced, piecing together the fragments of Harris's confession. Evelyn hadn't been the one with the secret, Harris had. She had been the one who'd found out about the financial ruin he was facing and had planned to reveal the truth. In his desperation, Harris had tried to silence her, pushing her toward the edge, letting her believe she was trapped. Stephen's instincts told him that Harris was lying about his direct involvement in her death, but he was still a part of the larger puzzle. Evelyn had been cornered by the man she had trusted. Stephen stood, his expression impassive. You're coming with me, Mr. Harris. There are a few more things we need to discuss. Harris stood up too, but this time there was no confidence in his movements. His mask had cracked, revealing the guilt beneath, and Stephen knew he was one step closer to unraveling the truth. The rain had intensified by the time Stephen returned to the Harper estate, his trench coat drenched, the weight of his findings pressing heavily on his shoulders. Alan Harris had cracked, but his confession had been far from complete. The financial troubles, the affair, it was all part of the story. But there was more, something darker and more calculated than Stephen had anticipated. Stephen had enough evidence to piece together the events leading to Evelyn's death, but he knew there was one last confrontation to have. Richard Harper needed to be confronted with the truth about his wife's affair, the financial straits they were both facing, and his own complicity in it all. It was time to unravel the final threads. Stephen entered the mansion, greeted by the subdued silence that seemed to hang over the place since Evelyn's death. Richard was in the study, as expected, sitting behind his desk, his face weary and gaunt from days of stress and grief. "Detective," Richard greeted, his voice hollow. "Have you found anything new? Or are you here to tell me what I already know?" Stephen didn't waste time with pleasantries. He placed the photographs of Evelyn and Alan Harris on the desk in front of Richard, watching as his expression shifted from one of indifference to something colder. "You were right about one thing," Stephen began, his voice low but firm. "Evelyn wasn't perfect. She was hiding things from you, things you didn't want to know." Richard's eyes darted to the photos, but he remained silent, his fingers curling into tight fists. "She was having an affair with Alan Harris," Stephen continued, his tone unyielding. "But that wasn't the only thing. She had figured out what was going on, your financial ruin, Harris's role in it. And she was planning to expose him, to stop everything from unraveling. And then, she died." Richard didn't respond immediately, his gaze fixed on the photos. For a moment, Stephen could see the wheels turning in his mind, the truth slowly sinking in. "You think I did it, don't you?" Richard's voice was barely above a whisper, but there was a sharpness to it, an edge that betrayed his calm facade. "You think I killed my wife because of her affair?" Stephen's eyes didn't leave Richard's. "No. But I think you knew what was coming. I think you knew she was going to expose Harris, and you wanted to stop it. You wanted to protect your name, your reputation. Maybe you didn't kill her directly, but you certainly allowed Harris to believe it was the only way to save his business." Richard's face tightened, and for the first time, Stephen saw the mask slip. His mouth trembled slightly as he spoke. "You have no idea what it was like, living with her. I couldn't let her ruin everything. I couldn't let her ruin me." Stephen could see the guilt written all over Richard's face, but he wasn't ready to let him off the hook just yet. "You were complicit, Richard. You let her die, all for the sake of protecting yourself. And you didn't care who had to suffer. Whether it was her or you, it didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was keeping your secrets safe." Richard's expression turned to one of fury, his hands slamming against the desk. "You have no idea what it's like to lose everything. To have your world crumble around you. She had a choice, detective. She had a choice, and she couldn't handle the truth." Stephen remained calm, his voice unwavering. "And now you have a choice, Richard. You can face the consequences of your actions, or you can keep running from them. But either way, you're going to pay for what happened." For a long moment, there was silence between them, broken only by the sound of the rain tapping against the windows. Stephen watched as Richard's anger slowly drained, replaced by the hollow realization that there was nowhere left to hide. Finally, Richard slumped back in his chair, his eyes vacant. "I didn't want her to die. But I didn't want to lose everything, either. I just didn't know what to do." Stephen's gaze softened, but only for a moment. "You should have told her the truth. But instead, you let it all spiral out of control." Richard looked at the photographs of his wife, his lips trembling as he finally spoke the words Stephen had been waiting for. "I never thought she'd die. I thought we could fix things. I thought," his voice broke off, and he turned away, his hands covering his face. Stephen stood up and turned toward the door. "It's too late for regrets, Richard. You should have thought of that before you let your secrets destroy everything." As he walked out of the study and back into the rain-soaked night, Stephen's mind churned with the weight of it all. The case was closed, but the truth had come at a price. Richard Harper had been complicit in his wife's death, and Alan Harris had played his part, too. But the real tragedy was how much they had all lost in the pursuit of self-preservation. Stephen paused on the doorstep, the cold rain pouring down over him, as the familiar ache of loss gripped him. The case had been solved, but the ghosts of his own past were never far behind. As he stepped into the night, the sound of his wife's laughter, soft, distant, echoed in his mind, a cruel reminder that some cases, no matter how they ended, never truly left you. Case 3, The Silent Widow. The morning was cloaked in a gray haze as Stephen Raul Hughes lit his first cigarette of the day, its ember flaring against the dim light filtering into his cramped office. The rhythmic ticking of the wall clock filled the silence until the door creaked open. A woman stepped inside, a striking figure draped in black, her veil obscuring most of her face but not the quiet grief that seemed to radiate from her. "Detective Hughes," she said softly, her voice as smooth as polished marble. "My name is Celeste Langford. I need your help." Stephen gestured for her to sit, studying her as she glided across the room to the chair opposite his desk. Her every movement was deliberate, her grief meticulously controlled, as though even mourning had become a performance. "What can I do for you, Mrs. Langford?" he asked, his tone measured. "My husband, Ethan Langford, passed away 2 weeks ago," she began, her fingers clutching the edges of her clutch. "His death was ruled a heart attack, but," she hesitated, her gaze dropping to the cigarette smoldering between Stephen's fingers. "But you think it wasn't," he finished for her. She nodded. "Ethan wasn't perfect, Detective. He was entangled in some unsavory business. But he was healthy. He was careful. A heart attack feels too convenient, especially when his affairs, financial and otherwise, are in such disarray." Stephen leaned back in his chair, exhaling a cloud of smoke. "And what exactly do you want me to do, Mrs. Langford?" "I want you to find out what really happened to Ethan," she replied, her voice steady despite the slight tremor in her hands. "And there's another matter. Someone has been blackmailing me." At this, Stephen's eyebrows rose slightly. "Blackmail?" "Yes," she confirmed, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I've been receiving anonymous letters threatening to expose indiscretions from my past. The demands aren't monetary. They're asking me to stay silent about Ethan's dealings." Stephen tapped his ash into the tray, his mind already racing through the implications. "And what exactly were these dealings?" Celeste hesitated, as if weighing the cost of her next words. "Ethan had connections with some dangerous people, loan sharks, gamblers, and perhaps worse. He owed a great deal of money to a man named Marcus Rayburn. I believe Rayburn is behind this." "Rayburn," Stephen repeated, the name familiar. "I've heard of him. Not the kind of man who forgives debts, even after death." "That's why I came to you, Detective," Celeste said, her voice cracking. "I need someone who can look where the police won't, someone who isn't afraid to find the truth." Stephen stubbed out his cigarette, his gaze locking with hers. "All right, Mrs. Langford. I'll look into your husband's death and these blackmail threats. But be warned, the truth rarely offers comfort." Celeste stood, her composure slipping for the first time as she extended a gloved hand. "Thank you, Detective. I don't need comfort, Just answers. As she left, the scent of her perfume lingered in the air, mixing with the acrid smoke. Stephen grabbed his coat and hat, his mind already piecing together the puzzle. A dead man with dangerous secrets, a widow with something to hide, and the shadow of Marcus Rayburn looming over it all. The game was on. Stephen tugged his coat tighter against the chill as he approached the Ember Club, one of Marcus Rayburn's known haunts. The place was tucked in the seedier side of the city, a haven for gamblers, drunks, and those who made their fortunes on other people's misfortunes. A red neon sign flickered above the door, casting an eerie glow onto the wet pavement. Inside, the air was thick with smoke and tension. Men crowded around tables, their eyes glued to cards or dice, while the occasional burst of laughter or curses punctuated the low hum of conversation. A jazz band played half-heartedly in the corner, their tunes drowned out by the clinking of glasses and the shuffle of money-exchanging hands. Stephen made his way to the bar, his presence earning a few curious glances but nothing more. He ordered a whiskey, letting the burn steady his nerves as he scanned the room. He wasn't here to gamble, he was here for information. The bartender, a wiry man with slicked-back hair and a perpetual scowl, leaned closer. "You're not one of the regulars. What brings you here?" "I'm looking for Marcus Rayburn," Stephen replied, his tone casual but firm. The bartender stiffened slightly, his hand pausing mid-polish on a glass. "Rayburn doesn't like strangers poking around." "You got a reason to see him?" Stephen slid a crisp bill across the counter. "Tell him it's about Ethan Langford. He'll want to hear this." The bartender hesitated before pocketing the money and nodding toward the back. "You'll find him in the private room. But a word of advice, don't waste his time." Stephen downed his whiskey and made his way to the rear of the club. A large man in a suit, undoubtedly one of Rayburn's enforcers, stood guard outside the door. "Business," the man grunted, his arms crossed. "Ethan Langford," Stephen said, his eyes meeting the man's unflinchingly. The enforcer gave him a hard look before stepping aside and opening the door. Inside, Marcus Rayburn was seated at a round table, a cigar clamped between his teeth. His slicked-back hair and sharp suit gave him the appearance of a businessman, but the gleam in his eyes betrayed something far more dangerous. "Detective Hughes," Rayburn said smoothly, exhaling a plume of smoke. "I've heard of you. Didn't think I'd have the pleasure of meeting you face to face. To what do I owe this visit?" Stephen sat down across from him, ignoring the other men in the room who were undoubtedly armed. "Ethan Langford owed you money." Rayburn smirked. "He owed a lot of people money. But yes, I had a stake in his little situation. And now he's dead," Stephen said bluntly. "Heart attack, they say. Convenient, wouldn't you agree?" Rayburn leaned back, his smile never wavering. "You think I had something to do with it?" "Detective, I run a business. Killing clients isn't good for business." Stephen wasn't convinced. Langford's widow is being blackmailed. Letters threatening her to keep quiet about his dealings. "I don't suppose you know anything about that?" Rayburn's smile faded slightly, replaced by a cold, calculating expression. "Blackmail isn't my style, detective. I don't waste time with letters and threats. If I wanted Celeste Langford silenced, you wouldn't be here asking questions." Stephen studied him, searching for any cracks in his facade. "Then who would want her silenced? And why?" Rayburn's gaze narrowed. "Langford wasn't just in debt to me. He was playing a dangerous game, trying to double-cross people who don't forgive betrayal. If I were you, I'd be asking around about his business partners. But tread carefully, detective. The people Langford crossed don't take kindly to prying eyes. Stephen stood, his hand brushing against the butt of his revolver out of habit. Thanks for the advice. I'll take it under consideration. Rayburn's smirk returned. Good luck, detective. You'll need it. As Stephen left the room, his mind churned with questions. Rayburn's denial felt genuine, but it was clear he knew more than he was letting on. If Ethan Langford had been double-crossing dangerous people, it wasn't just his debt that had cost him his life, it was the secrets he'd been keeping. The trail was growing darker, and Stephen could feel the noose tightening. But he wasn't about to back down. If there was one thing he knew, it was that the truth was rarely buried deep enough to stay hidden. Stephen leaned back in his office chair, the faint scent of Celeste Langford's perfume still lingering from their earlier meeting. Her words replayed in his mind, each one carefully chosen, deliberate, and measured. But there was something she wasn't saying, something he needed to uncover before her husband's death led him further into dangerous waters. The city outside his window was alive with the hum of neon lights and distant sirens as he mulled over his next move. The letters threatening Celeste weren't just about keeping her quiet, they were about controlling her. And the question was, why? The answer came sooner than expected. A knock on the door revealed a wiry man with sharp eyes and a nervous twitch. "You Hughes?" the man asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "That depends," Stephen replied, his gaze never leaving the man. The man slid an envelope across the desk. "This came from someone who doesn't want to be seen. Said you'd know what to do with it." Stephen opened the envelope carefully, revealing a stack of photographs. They were grainy but clear enough to recognize the people in them, Celeste Langford in the arms of a man who was not her husband. The backdrop was an upscale hotel, one known for its discretion. Stephen looked up, but the man was already gone. He flipped through the photographs, the pit in his stomach growing heavier with each one. This wasn't just evidence of an affair, it was leverage. Someone wanted to control Celeste, and this was the key. He decided it was time for another conversation with the widow. The Langford estate was a different place at night. The lights were dimmed, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly across the walls. Celeste met him in the parlor, her composure as pristine as ever, though her eyes betrayed the exhaustion of carrying too many secrets. "Detective," she said, her voice a touch colder this time. "Have you made progress?" Stephen didn't sit. Instead, he placed the photographs on the coffee table between them, watching as her expression shifted from curiosity to shock, and finally to something more unreadable. "Care to explain these?" he asked, his tone sharper than before. Celeste's hand trembled as she reached for the photos, her fingers lingering over the top one before pulling away. "Where did you get these?" "That's not important," Stephen replied. "What's important is who else has them, and why they're using them against you." She looked away, her jaw tightening. "You don't understand. Those were taken years ago, before Ethan and I were married. It was a mistake." Stephen raised an eyebrow. "Mistakes don't usually come with blackmail letters." Celeste stood abruptly, pacing to the window as if the act might help her gather her thoughts. "Ethan found out about the affair shortly after we married. He forgave me, or at least, he said he did. But the man in those photos, he didn't disappear quietly. He started showing up, demanding money, threatening to tell Ethan everything. And you paid him off, Stephen guessed. For a while, Celeste admitted, her voice barely audible. But when Ethan's financial troubles started, I couldn't keep up with the payments. That's when the letters began. Stephen sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. So your husband's death and these threats, they're connected. Someone's using your past to keep you in line, but for what purpose? Celeste turned back to him, her expression pleading. I told you, Ethan was involved with dangerous people. Whatever he was hiding, whatever got him killed, I think it has something to do with this. Stephen crossed his arms, his mind racing. And the man from the photographs? Where is he now? Her silence was answer enough. Stephen stepped closer, his voice firm. If I'm going to help you, I need everything, Mrs. Langford. No more omissions, no more half-truths. Who is he? Celeste hesitated before finally whispering, his name was Victor Carradine. He disappeared a few months before Ethan's death. I don't know where he is or if he's even alive. Stephen's jaw tightened. Carradine isn't the type to just vanish. If he's not alive, someone made sure of it. And if he is, he's still playing a part in all this. Celeste's eyes brimmed with unshed tears. Please, detective. Find out who's behind this. Find out why Ethan died. Stephen nodded, slipping the photographs back into the envelope. I will. But you need to be ready for whatever comes next. As he left the estate, the weight of the case pressed down on him. The trail was growing murkier, the players more dangerous. But one thing was clear, Ethan Langford's death was just the tip of the iceberg, and Stephen was diving headfirst into the depths. The rain hammered against the city, a relentless drumming that matched the tension knotting Stephen's gut as he drove toward the dimly lit alleyways of Old Harbor. His destination was a seedy boarding house where whispers claimed Victor Carradine had once holed up. The name had come up again during his inquiries, a man of shadows, debts, and desperation. The building was as decrepit as its reputation, its peeling paint and sagging roof a testament to years of neglect. Inside, the stench of mildew and stale smoke assaulted Stephen's senses. He approached the landlady, a stout woman with a cigar dangling from her lips and suspicion in her bloodshot eyes. Looking for a ghost, are ya? She rasped when he mentioned Carradine's name. Not a ghost, Stephen replied, slipping her a bill. A lead. Her eyes gleamed as she pocketed the money. Carradine came and went. Stayed here a while, left in a hurry. Seemed scared. Real scared. Last I heard, he was running from someone meaner than he was. Who? Didn't say. But he left something behind, room 7. Nobody's stayed there since. Gives folks the creeps. Stephen didn't wait for more. He climbed the rickety stairs to the second floor, the floorboards groaning under his weight. Room 7's door was locked, but the landlady had been generous enough to lend him the key. Inside, the room was a time capsule of neglect. Dust coated every surface, and the stale air was suffocating. Stephen's practiced eye scanned the space, noting the tipped-over chair and the faded scorch marks on the wallpaper. Whatever had happened here hadn't been clean. A thorough search turned up little, until he noticed the loose floorboard under the bed. He pried it up, revealing a small tin box. Inside were scraps of paper, receipts, letters, and a photograph. The photograph showed Victor Carradine with another man, none other than Marcus Rayburn. They stood beside a high-stakes poker table, both of them grinning like sharks who'd just swallowed their prey. "Bingo," Stephen muttered. The letters were more revealing. One was addressed to Carradine in sharp, commanding handwriting. "Victor, you've outlived your usefulness. If you value your life, you'll leave town before the clock runs out. Ethan Langford's debts are no longer your problem. You've been warned. Mar." Stephen's jaw tightened. Marcus Rayburn wasn't just a lone shark, he was orchestrating a much larger game. Carradine had been a pawn, expendable when he became inconvenient. And Langford's debts? They were part of a deeper conspiracy, one that might have cost him his life. A noise outside the room jolted Stephen from his thoughts. The creak of floorboards and a faint shuffle of feet. He slipped his revolver from its holster, the weight familiar in his hand as he moved silently toward the door. A figure darted past the open doorway, their shadow stretching along the wall. Stephen lunged, grabbing the intruder by the collar and slamming them against the hallway wall. It was a wiry young man, his face pale with fear. "Who sent you?" Stephen demanded, his grip unyielding. "And no one," the man stammered, his eyes darting wildly. "I swear, I was just—" Stephen pressed the barrel of the revolver against the man's temple, cutting off his excuses. "Try again." "Rayburn," the man blurted. "I swear, it was Rayburn. He said someone might come poking around here, told me to keep an eye out." Stephen released him with a shove, the man stumbling and scrambling down the stairs without looking back. Rayburn was tying up loose ends, just as Stephen had suspected. But what was the connection between Langford, Carradine, and the ruthless crime boss? The photograph and letter were pieces of the puzzle, but the bigger picture remained just out of reach. As Stephen stepped out into the rain, he knew one thing for certain: the answers he sought would bring him face to face with Marcus Rayburn again. And this time, the stakes would be higher than ever. The Ember Club was alive with its usual hum of vice and sin, but tonight, Marcus Rayburn had no interest in the poker games or the raucous laughter echoing through the room. He sat in his private lounge, flanked by two enforcers, a cigar glowing between his fingers. When Stephen entered, his coat dripping from the rain, the room seemed to hold its breath. Well, Rayburn said, exhaling a cloud of smoke. "Back so soon, Detective? I trust you've brought better accusations this time." Stephen didn't sit. Instead, he placed the photograph and letter he'd found in Carradine's room on the table between them. The smirk on Rayburn's face faltered slightly as he leaned forward, studying the evidence. "I don't recall inviting you to dig through my personal affairs," Rayburn said, his tone icy. "That's the problem with your affairs, Rayburn," Stephen shot back. "They're anything but personal. Carradine was one of your lackeys, wasn't he? A pawn in your game with Langford." Rayburn leaned back, feigning indifference. "Victor Carradine was a gambler and a fool. His debts were his own undoing." "Spare me the act," Stephen said sharply. "Carradine knew too much, and you wanted him out of the picture. But not before you used him to pressure Ethan Langford. What was the play, Rayburn? What was so valuable that you'd kill for it?" Rayburn's expression darkened, the air in the room growing heavier. "You're treading dangerous ground, Detective." Stephen leaned in, his voice low but firm. "You had Langford under your thumb. His debts gave you leverage, but you didn't count on one thing, his wife. Celeste knew about your blackmail. That's why she's being threatened now, isn't it? To keep her quiet about whatever Langford was hiding. Rayburn's eyes narrowed, but he remained silent. Let me guess, Stephen continued. Langford was laundering money for you. That's why his finances were a mess. But then he got cold feet and decided to cut ties. Only, you couldn't let him walk away clean. So you used Carradine to apply pressure until Langford buckled. Or until you had him silenced. Rayburn stubbed out his cigar, his movements slow and deliberate. You're a clever man, Hughes. But clever men have a habit of overreaching. Stephen's hand rested on his revolver, the tension between them crackling like a live wire. Try me, Rayburn. I've got enough here to bring you down. The only question is how far you're willing to fall. For a moment, the room was silent, the weight of unspoken threats hanging heavy in the air. Then, to Stephen's surprise, Rayburn chuckled, a low, dangerous sound. You think you've got it all figured out, Rayburn said. But Langford wasn't just laundering money. He was skimming off the top. That's why he's dead. Not because of me, detective, but because he got greedy. The people he crossed? They're bigger than you, me, or anyone in this city. Stephen's grip on his revolver tightened. Names, Rayburn. Who's pulling the strings? Rayburn leaned forward, his gaze cold and unyielding. You're in over your head, Hughes. Walk away now, and maybe you'll live long enough to regret it. Stephen stared him down, his mind racing. Rayburn was scared, but not of him. Whoever Langford had betrayed was far more dangerous than the crime boss sitting before him. He gathered the photograph and letter, standing to leave. This isn't over, Rayburn. If you're smart, you'll start talking before someone silences you, too. Rayburn's smirk returned, but it was laced with unease. Good luck, detective. You'll need it. Outside, the rain had lessened, but the storm in Stephen's mind raged on. Rayburn's cryptic warning gnawed at him, the implications far darker than he'd anticipated. Langford's death was no simple crime of passion or greed, it was part of a web of corruption that stretched beyond the city's underbelly. As he lit a cigarette and walked toward his car, the sound of laughter from the club drifted into the night. For a fleeting moment, Stephen imagined his wife's laugh, soft and full of life. But it was gone as quickly as it came, leaving only the echo of his footsteps on the wet pavement. The case wasn't over, not by a long shot. And with every step closer to the truth, Stephen could feel the shadows closing in. Case 4, Whispers in the Dark. The rain had subsided, but the city still held a damp chill in the air. Stephen stood in the doorway of his office, watching the haze of headlights from passing cars blur into streaks of light on the wet streets. His mind was elsewhere, a constant hum of unfinished cases, unanswered questions, and the haunting image of his wife's death that never seemed to fade. Then the phone rang. Detective Hughes? The voice was shaky, laced with desperation. My sister, she's gone. Please, you have to help me. The woman on the other end introduced herself as Eleanor Grant, her voice trembling as she explained the disappearance of her sister, Alice. It was the 4th disappearance this month, and the 3rd of its kind in the past 6 months. Alice Grant was a well-respected nurse, last seen leaving a high-end medical clinic late one evening. But she had never returned home. Stephen listened carefully, his brow furrowing as Eleanor outlined the details. Alice hadn't been the type to run off. She'd been committed to her work, her family, she had everything to live for. Yet, just like the others before her, there were no signs of struggle, no ransom notes, no phone calls. Just an empty space where she had been, as if she'd never existed at all. Stephen made his decision. "I'll take the case," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Meet me at your sister's apartment in 2 hours." The apartment was small but neat, a reflection of Alice's meticulous nature. There were photos of her family on the walls, framed certificates of her nursing degrees, and a stack of medical journals by the bed. Everything suggested a life well lived, a person who cared deeply for others. Stephen moved through the space, his sharp eyes scanning for anything out of place. There was nothing to suggest foul play, no broken windows, no signs of a forced entry. Yet something about the scene felt off. The air was thick with the sensation of something unsaid, something hidden. Eleanor Grant, a woman in her early 30s, sat on the couch, wringing her hands as she spoke. "I don't know what happened, Detective. Alice was just gone. The clinic she worked at, Dr. Voss's place, they don't seem to know anything. They said she left late that night, like usual. But that was the last time anyone saw her. Dr. Lucien Voss." The name rang a bell. A prominent surgeon with a flawless reputation, known for pioneering surgeries in his field. But there was something unsettling about the man. Something that Stephen couldn't quite put his finger on. "Tell me about the clinic," Stephen said, leaning in slightly, his eyes narrowing with focused intent. "Who's in charge? Who would have access to patient files or employee schedules?" Eleanor's eyes flickered with uncertainty. "It's a high-end place, very exclusive. Dr. Voss runs it with a tight-knit staff. But, some of the nurses said strange things about the clinic. Not many people know this, but there's talk of patients disappearing, just vanishing. No records, no follow-up. Like they were erased from existence." Stephen's expression darkened. This was no ordinary missing persons case. It felt like something much larger, something that tied into the kind of medical malpractice he had heard rumors about, unspeakable things hidden behind closed doors, beneath the veneer of respected professionals. "Do you have any names?" he asked, his voice steady but edged with urgency. Eleanor hesitated, but then nodded. "There's a nurse named Margaret, she used to work there. She quit a few months ago, but she knows something. I can put you in touch with her." As Stephen left the apartment, the rain had started again, the heavy downpour a fitting backdrop for the storm of questions swirling in his mind. Alice Grant's disappearance was just one piece of a puzzle, but there was something about it that felt all too familiar. He could feel the threads pulling together in the shadows, but he wasn't yet sure what they would reveal. The clinic. Dr. Voss. Nurses disappearing. It was all connected, and he knew it was only a matter of time before he uncovered something far darker than anyone realized. The next step was clear: find Margaret, and find the answers that the clinic was so desperately trying to hide. The rain pounded against the windshield as Stephen drove through the dimly lit streets. He had spent the last hour tracking down Margaret, the nurse who had left Dr. Voss's clinic under mysterious circumstances. Eleanor Grant had given him her contact information, but when Stephen called, he found her to be wary, reluctant to talk. It took a few convincing words, promising her anonymity and protection for speaking out, before she agreed to meet. The address she provided led him to a run-down apartment complex on the outskirts of the city. The building looked as though it had been abandoned years ago, with broken windows and peeling paint that spoke to the neglect of its residents. A far cry from the pristine medical facility Alice had worked at. Stephen parked his car, his mind churning over the case as he stepped into the building's shadowy hallway. He found apartment 3B at the end of the corridor, the door slightly ajar. He knocked lightly before pushing it open, stepping into the dimly lit room. Margaret was sitting at a small kitchen table, her face worn with the heaviness of something unspeakable. She was in her late 30s, with a weary look in her eyes, as if the weight of what she knew was slowly eroding her sense of self. "Detective Hughes?" she asked, her voice hesitant. Stephen nodded. "Margaret. You're not easy to find." She gave a faint, humorless smile. "I've been trying to stay out of sight for a reason, Detective. The less people know about me, the better." Stephen took a seat opposite her, studying her face for any signs of fear, guilt, or something deeper. "I need your help. I'm investigating a missing persons case, Alice Grant. She worked at Dr. Voss's clinic." Margaret's eyes flickered, but she quickly masked her reaction. "I don't know anything about Alice Grant." "I think you do," Stephen said quietly, his gaze unwavering. "I know about the disappearances. The patients, the staff, people vanishing without a trace. And I know you left the clinic suddenly, with no explanation." Margaret's hand trembled slightly as she gripped the edge of the table. "It wasn't sudden," she murmured, avoiding his eyes. "I couldn't stay after what I saw. People disappearing, but not the way they think. It wasn't just patients. It was staff too. Alice, she knew too much. That's why she's gone." Stephen leaned in. "What do you mean? What did she know?" Margaret's breath quickened, but she held his gaze. "I can't say it outright, Detective. But the clinic wasn't just a place for surgeries, it was a front. They were doing experiments. And some of the patients, they weren't there for medical treatment. They were part of something else. And Alice, she found out." Stephen sat back, his mind racing. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but the picture was still too unclear. What kind of experiments? What was Dr. Voss involved in? Margaret hesitated, looking over her shoulder as if expecting someone to appear. "I can't give you the full details. But it's not just Dr. Voss. It's bigger than him. There are people in power behind the clinic. People with connections, people in the health ministry. Ministers, high-ranking officials. It's all tied up with corruption, black market medical trials, and money." Stephen's stomach churned. This wasn't just a case of missing people or malpractice, it was part of a far-reaching conspiracy, one that went to the highest levels of power. His wife had died because of something like this. She had been getting too close to the truth. Who else is involved? Stephen pressed. Margaret's eyes darted nervously. "I can't say. They've been watching me ever since I left. I've already said too much." She looked down at her hands. But Alice, she was going to expose them. She was collecting evidence. "I don't know what happened to her, but I know she's not just missing. They took her." Stephen rose, his mind working rapidly as he pieced together the fragments of Margaret's words. "You don't have to tell me everything. But I need to know one thing. What evidence did Alice have?" Margaret swallowed hard. "I don't know all the details. But she mentioned something about files, records of patients that didn't exist, of surgeries that were altered, people who had died, but the deaths were covered up. She found a connection between the clinic and the health ministry's top officials. The evidence was in a file, a flash drive. She told me she'd give it to me, but before she did, she disappeared. Stephen's pulse quickened. He had to find that flash drive. He had to find Alice before whoever was behind all of this covered their tracks completely. He leaned forward, his voice low and intense. Where would Alice have kept it? If she had it, where would she have hidden it? Margaret looked up at him, fear in her eyes. I don't know, but she said she'd hidden it in the one place they'd never think to look, a place where no one would ever think to search. Stephen stared at her, a cold realization setting in. He knew the answer. Where? He asked, his voice a whisper. Margaret hesitated, then leaned in close. Her father's grave. The night had swallowed the city whole as Stephen stood before the small, weather-worn cemetery on the outskirts of town. Alice Grant's father had been laid to rest here, a humble plot in the corner, surrounded by weeds and overgrown grass. The cemetery felt desolate, abandoned, much like the case itself. No one had paid much attention to Alice Grant's disappearance, just another forgotten woman lost to the dark corners of a city too busy to care. But for Stephen, it was a thread that could unravel a vast and dangerous conspiracy. He'd taken the train, arriving just as the last hint of daylight faded, leaving him in the company of streetlights and the soft rustling of trees. Margaret's words had echoed in his head. Alice hid it in the one place no one would think to look, her father's grave. Stephen didn't believe in coincidences. He didn't believe in fate. But the more he uncovered about the web surrounding Dr. Voss's clinic, the more he knew he was getting closer. Alice had been a woman with purpose, and her disappearance was no accident. She had fought to expose something monstrous, something tied to the highest levels of power. With a gloved hand, he brushed aside the thick grass growing over the grave of Alice's father. The weathered headstone was nearly illegible, the stone worn smooth from years of neglect. There was no sign of anything unusual, no hidden compartments, no markings to indicate a secret stash. Yet, Stephen knew better than to ignore his instincts. He knelt down, pressing his hands against the cool, damp earth. His fingers brushed against something hard, a faint outline beneath the soil. A chill ran down his spine as he pulled out a small, weatherproof metal box. The weight of it felt significant, and he could almost hear his heartbeat echoing in his ears. He opened the box carefully, revealing a flash drive, its plastic casing scratched and well-worn, but intact. The drive seemed so ordinary, yet Stephen knew that in his hands rested the key to unraveling everything. The drive contained Alice's evidence. It was the truth that had cost her life, and it was the truth that could bring down those responsible for her death. Stephen stood up, the box clutched tightly in his hand. As he made his way back to the car, the rain began to fall again, harder this time, as if the heavens themselves were conspiring to cleanse him of the darkness he had just uncovered. But Stephen was far from cleansed. He was deeper in than ever before, and there was no turning back now. Back at his office, Stephen inserted the flash drive into his computer, his fingers hovering over the keys. His mind raced as the screen flickered to life. The contents of the drive were encrypted, and though it was a simple task for him to crack the code, he couldn't shake the sense of urgency pressing down on him. Every second that passed brought more danger. The files unfolded before his eyes, patient records, surgical logs, emails, photographs, and spreadsheets that connected Dr. Lucien Voss and his clinic to a shocking network of corruption. The health ministry was involved, yes, but there were even darker forces at play. A shadow network, using the clinic as a front for illegal medical experiments. The patients weren't just victims of malpractice, they were test subjects, caught in a web of human experimentation, their bodies used for procedures no one had authorized, all in the name of profit. But it was the photographs that struck him the hardest, photographs of Alice Grant herself. She had been at the clinic, posing as a patient to get access to the medical files. There was one photo in particular, a grainy image of her standing in front of Dr. Voss, a man in his mid-40s with a stern, calculating expression. She was smiling, unaware of the danger she was in, holding a stack of documents. And there it was, on the back of the photo, a single name, Maximilian Ward. Stephen froze. The name meant nothing to him at first, but something about it nagged at the back of his mind. He leaned forward, scanning the rest of the files. Maximilian Ward, another doctor, a prominent figure with ties to the health ministry. A man who had been in the right place at the right time to cover up the worst crimes imaginable. Stephen's pulse quickened. He had uncovered a name, but the full scope of the conspiracy was still a mystery. Who was Ward? How deep did the corruption go? He had uncovered the clinic's operations, but now he needed to know who was pulling the strings. As Stephen pieced together the puzzle, a gnawing sensation took hold of him. Margaret's words from earlier in the day haunted him, "It's bigger than Voss." There are people in power behind the clinic. Alice's search for the truth had cost her everything. But it wasn't just Alice, there were other missing patients, other lives ruined by the twisted machinations of those in control. Stephen's phone buzzed, pulling him out of his thoughts. The number was unlisted. He answered it immediately, his mind racing with possibilities. "Detective Hughes," a voice rasped on the other end, "you're getting too close." Stephen's grip tightened around the phone. He knew this voice. It was familiar, though it sent a cold shiver through him. "Who is this?" The voice chuckled softly, a low, chilling sound. "You've been digging, Hughes. But I wouldn't get too comfortable. We know everything. You've been warned." The line went dead before Stephen could respond. Suddenly, everything was clear. Maximilian Ward was more than just a name. He was the final piece of the puzzle. But the person behind the phone call was someone even more dangerous, someone who had a vested interest in keeping Stephen from learning the truth. Stephen's resolve hardened. The trail was leading him closer to the people who had orchestrated his wife's death. The closer he got to the truth, the more dangerous this case became. And now, the real hunt was on. The early morning light filtered weakly through the blinds, casting long shadows across Stephen's cluttered desk. His mind churned, racing with the information he had uncovered the night before. Maximilian Ward's name echoed in his mind, now more than just a lead, but the linchpin to the entire conspiracy. The phone call had shaken him, but it also solidified his resolve. Whoever was behind this, whoever was willing to go to such extremes to silence him, had underestimated his determination. Stephen had spent the night poring over the files on the flash drive, digging deeper into the connections between Dr. Voss, Maximilian Ward, and the corruption that had engulfed the health ministry. He had seen the evidence, but something was still missing. There was one more piece of the puzzle, one last name that might hold the key to everything. Dr. Lucien Voss. The man had been a shadowy figure in the case from the beginning, but now Stephen knew that Voss wasn't just a cog in the machine, he was at the center of it all. Voss was the one who had facilitated the experiments, who had hidden the truth beneath layers of deceit and lies. And Stephen knew he had to confront him, face to face, before it was too late. He grabbed his coat and made his way to Dr. Voss's private practice. The clinic was tucked away on a quiet street in the upscale part of town, an area that had an air of wealth and influence. The kind of place where deals were made behind closed doors, and secrets were kept under lock and key. Stephen had already spoken with a few of the staff, all of whom had been tight-lipped or disappeared. But he was done waiting. He had the evidence now, and it was time to bring the truth into the light. Dr. Lucien Voss's office was immaculate, like the rest of the clinic, a polished facade of sophistication designed to mask the dark undercurrent that flowed beneath it. When Stephen arrived, the receptionist greeted him with practiced politeness, but he could see the nervous tension in her eyes. They all knew who he was, what he was here for. And they were scared. "I need to speak with Dr. Voss," Stephen said, his tone firm but calm. "It's urgent." The receptionist hesitated, her fingers hovering over the phone. "Dr. Voss is unavailable at the moment, Detective. Could you please leave your contact information?" "I'm not here to leave a message," Stephen replied, his eyes narrowing. "I'm here to speak with him now." The receptionist's face paled as she glanced over her shoulder. "He's not in his office today." "Perhaps." Before she could finish, the door to the back office opened, and Dr. Lucien Voss himself appeared in the doorway, his sharp features and calculated gaze settling on Stephen. There was no warmth in his smile, only the coldness of someone who had seen too much and cared for nothing. "Detective Hughes," Voss said smoothly, his voice tinged with an unsettling calm. "I've been expecting you." Stephen's pulse quickened. He had been expecting this moment, but nothing could have prepared him for the cool arrogance that radiated from Voss. He knew this man was dangerous, but now, more than ever, Stephen was certain he was dealing with a man who could destroy lives without a second thought. "Do you mind if we speak in private?" Voss continued, stepping back into his office and motioning for Stephen to follow. Stephen didn't hesitate. He stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room. There were no obvious signs of anything illegal, no stacks of papers, no documents left out in the open. But Stephen knew better than to trust appearances. Voss closed the door behind them and took a seat behind his large, polished desk. "Please, have a seat," he said, his voice silky smooth. "I imagine you've come to ask me about Alice Grant. And perhaps, about the people who've disappeared from my clinic." Stephen remained standing, his gaze never leaving Voss. "I have questions, yes. And I have evidence. You're going to answer them." Voss's lips curled into a slight smile, but there was no humor in it. "I'm sure you think you have something, Detective. But I wonder what you truly understand about what you've stumbled into." Stephen's eyes narrowed. "I understand that you've been conducting illegal medical experiments, that you've been involved in a vast corruption network reaching into the highest echelons of the health ministry. I know you've been silencing people, deleting evidence, making people disappear. And I know that Alice Grant found out." The smile faltered, just for a moment, before Voss composed himself. "You've been digging, haven't you? I have to admit, I'm impressed. But there's so much more to this than you realize." Stephen's voice was low and dangerous. "Tell me what you've done, Dr. Voss. Tell me why you killed Alice. Tell me why you killed my wife." The words hung heavy in the air, and for the first time, Voss's expression shifted, just slightly. His fingers drummed lightly on the desk as he studied Stephen. "Your wife. Alice Grant. They were both pawns in a much larger game, Detective. This isn't just about money or power. It's about survival, about evolution. People like you and me, we can't see it, but there's a bigger picture. The clinic, the experiments, everything we've done, it's for the future of humanity." Stephen's heart raced as he listened, disgust rising in his throat. "You're using people as lab rats, killing them for a twisted experiment, and for what? Some utopian future?" Voss leaned forward, his eyes glinting with cold excitement. "You don't understand. It's not about a utopia, it's about control. It's about power. What you see as murder, I see as progress. People like you, you don't understand what it takes to build something greater." Stephen's hands clenched into fists, his anger rising. "And what about Alice? What about my wife? They didn't deserve to die for your progress." For a moment, Voss's smile returned. It was the smile of a man who believed he was untouchable. They were just the unfortunate ones caught in the middle. But that's how it goes. Sacrifices must be made, Detective. And you've become too much of a threat to ignore. Before Stephen could react, Voss pressed a button on his desk. The door clicked open, and two large men stepped into the room, their presence overwhelming. They were no ordinary bodyguards, they were trained, dangerous, and they were here to end this conversation. Stephen knew the fight was on, but he also knew this wasn't the end. Not yet. He had to survive, to bring everything to light. But now, for the first time in his career, he realized that the true battle had just begun. The two men entered the room like shadows, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpet as they stood silently by the door. Their presence was immediate, suffocating, a reminder of the danger Stephen had knowingly walked into. Voss remained seated, his fingers steepled together in a gesture of quiet superiority, as though he were watching a chess game unfold. "Don't make this harder on yourself, Detective," Voss said, his voice smooth, but there was a thin edge of menace beneath the calm. "You've uncovered some truths that you shouldn't have. Now, it's time for you to leave this place. Leave, and forget about Alice Grant, your wife, and everything you think you understand." Stephen's body was tense, every nerve alight with adrenaline, but he didn't move a muscle. He kept his eyes fixed on Voss, the words of his wife's death echoing in his mind. She had died for knowing too much. Alice Grant had died because she, too, had learned something she wasn't supposed to know. Stephen wasn't going to make the same mistake. "You killed her, didn't you?" Stephen's voice was barely above a whisper, but the words hit like a punch. "You killed my wife because she knew about the corruption. Because she uncovered what you were doing." Voss's smile faltered just for a second before it returned, colder than before. "Your wife, Alice. They were unfortunate casualties. But they were part of something much larger. You can't see it now, but in time, you'll understand. There are forces at play here far beyond your comprehension." Stephen's jaw clenched. His blood boiled with the anger of a man who had lost everything. But he had learned long ago that anger, if not controlled, was a weapon that would destroy you as quickly as your enemies. One of the guards moved toward him, a hulking figure, his fists like concrete. Stephen's mind raced, calculating. He was cornered, but not defeated, not yet. Without warning, Stephen moved. He lunged toward the desk, knocking over a stack of medical files, and in a fluid motion, he grabbed a heavy paperweight. It was a quick decision, instinctual, the kind of movement that comes from years of dangerous encounters. The man who had advanced toward him swung a fist, but Stephen sidestepped, grabbing the paperweight and smashing it into the guard's face. There was a sickening crack as the man staggered back, blood streaming from his nose, his vision clouded. Stephen didn't hesitate. He used the distraction to dive to the side, moving toward the door. The other guard made a grab for him, but Stephen was faster. He darted into the hallway, just as the guard's outstretched hand grazed his coat. "Get him!" Voss's voice rang out behind him, a sharp command that sent the remaining guard barreling after him. Stephen's heart pounded in his chest as he sprinted down the hallway, the sound of heavy footsteps chasing him. His mind was a blur, focused on one thing: escape. He needed to get out of the building, get to safety, and figure out what his next move would be. He had the evidence, Alice's flash drive, and the truth, but without a plan, it would all be for nothing. He reached the stairwell and descended 2 flights of stairs in a blur, the distant sound of more footsteps behind him, but they were still too far to catch up. Stephen's hand grazed the cold metal of the exit door. He flung it open, spilling out into the alleyway behind the clinic. The rain had started again, a steady drizzle that washed the city in a dull gray. Stephen didn't stop to take a breath. He kept running, each stride carrying him further away from the danger of Dr. Voss and the nightmarish web of corruption he had uncovered. His mind kept racing, Maximilian Ward's name still fresh in his thoughts, the final piece of the puzzle that had to be confronted. As he turned a corner, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He didn't stop to answer it. He knew it was probably just a threat from Voss's people. But when the phone buzzed again, he hesitated. Pulling the phone from his pocket, he saw an unfamiliar number on the screen. Hesitant, Stephen answered. "Detective Hughes," a familiar voice said, low and calm. "I think we need to talk." It was Margaret's voice, calm, but there was an undercurrent of urgency. She had helped him earlier, given him the lead on Alice Grant, but now there was something more. Something she wasn't saying. Stephen paused, his breath heavy. "Margaret? Where are you?" "I'm at the old clinic. The one near the docks. It's the last place they'll look for me. Meet me there, and I'll explain everything." The line went dead before Stephen could respond. The rain fell harder as Stephen made his way to the old clinic. The city felt empty, like a hollow shell, as if even the streets knew something dark was on the horizon. He could feel the weight of everything pressing down on him. The pieces were coming together, but they weren't pretty. What he had discovered about Dr. Voss was only the beginning. The deeper he went, the more tangled the web became. The old clinic stood at the edge of the docks, a decaying building wrapped in shadows. There were no lights, no signs of life, just the eerie silence that hung in the air. Stephen approached cautiously, his instincts on high alert. He had no idea what Margaret was involved in, but he trusted her. She had given him the most valuable lead in the case so far. The door creaked open as Stephen stepped inside. The dim light from the street lamps outside barely illuminated the room, but in the far corner, he saw a figure standing. It was Margaret. Her face was pale, and there was something in her eyes, something that told him this meeting would change everything. "Stephen," she said, her voice low. "There's a lot more to this than you realize. Voss isn't just a doctor, he's part of something much bigger. And you're right to be looking for Maximilian Ward. But you need to know that the people involved in this, they'll do anything to protect themselves. Even kill." Stephen swallowed hard. "I've already seen that firsthand. But I'm not backing down. I'll find the truth." Margaret stepped closer, her eyes darting around nervously. "You don't understand. It's not just about exposing them. It's about surviving. There's more at play here, people who have been involved in this conspiracy for years. You can't fight them alone." Stephen's heart pounded in his chest. He had thought he was prepared for everything, but now he realized just how deep the danger went. "Then help me. Help me bring them down." Margaret hesitated, looking over her shoulder one last time. "There's a safe house. I'll give you the address. But you need to trust me, Stephen. The truth is more dangerous than you think." Stephen didn't have time to waste. The stakes had just gotten higher. And he was about to enter the final stretch of this twisted game, where every shadow might hold a deadly secret, and every step he took could be his last. Case 5, The Midnight Express. The Midnight Express was a train of distinction. It cut through the night, winding its way through the isolated mountains, its polished brass gleaming in the moonlight. For those fortunate enough to travel aboard it, it promised luxury, comfort, and an escape from the mundane. It was a silent oasis amid the snow-covered landscape. Detective Raul Hughes had boarded the train quietly, as he always did when he traveled alone. A few murmurs from other passengers, a slight nod from the conductor, and he was on his way to his destination, a remote lodge where an old friend awaited. He wasn't expecting much, a quiet journey, perhaps a moment to clear his head. But as the night wore on, it became clear that this journey would be anything but peaceful. It happened suddenly, without warning. A woman's scream shattered the calm of the evening, and the distant echo of panic quickly spread through the compartments. Stephen had been sipping his coffee in the dining car when the cry pierced the air. His instincts kicked in immediately. He rose from his seat, his hand instinctively brushing the revolver at his side as he made his way toward the source of the commotion. The corridors were filled with confusion as the passengers scrambled to understand what had happened. A few whispered nervously, others were simply too stunned to move. Stephen, however, kept his pace steady. He had been through enough to know that panic never solved anything. The door to the first-class compartment was ajar, and Stephen entered. The body was sprawled on the floor, blood pooling around it. A man in his early 40s, dressed in a dark suit, lay motionless. His throat had been slit, the blood staining his white shirt and the plush carpet beneath him. It was a clean kill, no signs of a struggle. The door to the compartment had been locked from the inside. No way in, no way out. The woman who had screamed was kneeling beside the body, her face pale with shock. Her breath came in shallow, frantic gasps as she glanced up at Stephen. "It's him. It's Samuel Blake," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. "He's dead." Stephen crouched beside the body, his sharp eyes scanning the room. Samuel Blake, well known in certain circles, a businessman of considerable influence. What had happened? Why was he murdered on this train, in such a calculated manner? The room itself was nearly pristine, except for the body and a piece of paper lying on the desk beside Blake. It was hastily written, almost too hurried. Stephen leaned over to read the note. "You'll pay for what you did. The truth is closer than you think." A cryptic message, but one that suggested this was no random act of violence. There was a purpose behind it, a reason. And that reason, Stephen knew, would lie buried among the passengers and their secrets. He stood up, his gaze sweeping over the room. Whoever had committed this murder was still aboard the train. And it was up to him to find out who, and why. Turning to the woman, Stephen's voice was calm, measured. "What do you know about Mr. Blake? And why were you near his compartment?" The woman wiped her tears, trying to compose herself. "I don't know why. I was just talking to him earlier. We were discussing business. He told me he had a meeting to attend and then I heard the noise. I came to check, and I found him like this." Stephen studied her closely. She was nervous, but was it because of the situation, or something else? "Do you know of anyone who might want him dead?" he asked. She shook her head, the tears now flowing freely. No, I don't." But Stephen wasn't convinced. Her fear was too apparent. The others on the train would be equally wary. It was time to speak to the rest of the passengers. The midnight express hummed softly as it barreled through the snowy mountains, the rhythmic click-clack of the wheels on the tracks the only sound breaking the stillness of the night. Inside, the atmosphere had shifted. Where once there was a sense of tranquility, now there was only tension. Stephen stood in the doorway of the compartment, surveying the scene. The body of Samuel Blake lay still on the floor, and the woman who had discovered him, Clara, remained trembling at his side, her tear-filled eyes flicking nervously from Stephen to the lifeless body. Stephen's mind was already at work. The clean nature of the murder, the precision with which Blake had been killed, spoke of an experienced hand. The fact that the door had been locked from the inside, and that no one had seen anything, made this murder all the more perplexing. Turning away from the body, Stephen looked around the compartment for anything that could shed light on the killer. There was the hastily scribbled note on the desk, a cryptic message that only deepened the mystery. "You'll pay for what you did. The truth is closer than you think." Was Blake involved in something more dangerous than just business? A victim of a vendetta? Or perhaps, the note was a decoy, designed to mislead. "Clara," Stephen said, keeping his voice soft. "I need to ask you a few more questions. Was there anything unusual about Blake's behavior today? Anything at all that seemed out of place?" Clara, still visibly shaken, shook her head slowly. "No. He was acting normal. But he was always so distant, you know? Always focused on something. He didn't seem worried, though." Stephen nodded, mentally noting her lack of detail. He then turned and walked to the door of the compartment, stepping out into the corridor. The other passengers had been herded into the dining car, but the mood was far from festive. There were no conversations, only hushed whispers, nervous glances, and the clinking of glasses as people tried to maintain composure. Stephen's first stop was the conductor, who stood at the front of the car, attempting to keep the passengers in check. His eyes were narrow with concern, and he seemed particularly uneasy about the situation. "Mr. Hughes," the conductor greeted, his voice strained. "This is a tragedy. You know we're isolated out here. There's nowhere to stop for miles. What are we going to do?" Stephen's eyes locked on the conductor's. "We don't do anything yet. I need you to gather the passengers in the dining car and keep them there. No one leaves the train. I'll need to speak to each of them individually." The conductor nodded briskly, his hands shaking slightly as he moved away. Stephen took a deep breath, mentally preparing for what would be a long night. He knew that the truth was hidden somewhere within the passengers on this train. He just had to find it. Stephen entered the dining car, his sharp eyes immediately scanning the room. The group of passengers had gathered around, some sitting quietly, others looking around nervously, but all avoiding eye contact. Clara had joined the group, still visibly distressed. Among the passengers was an elderly man who sat with a glass of scotch in his hand, a young woman who kept her eyes down, and a middle-aged man who seemed uncomfortably aware of his surroundings. There was also a well-dressed businessman who seemed far too calm for someone whose travel companion had just been murdered. Stephen's gaze lingered on each of them for a moment longer than necessary, assessing their reactions, looking for the smallest sign of guilt or fear. He then cleared his throat and addressed the group. "I'm Detective Stephen Raul Hughes. I understand this is a distressing situation, but I need you all to stay calm. A murder has occurred, and no one is leaving this train until we have answers." He paused, letting the gravity of his words sink in before continuing. "I'm going to speak with each of you individually. No one is to leave their seat until I've had a chance to ask questions. Understood?" A chorus of murmurs and nods followed, but there was one person who didn't seem bothered by Stephen's authority. The businessman, Mr. Arden, caught Stephen's eye. He was sitting with his legs casually crossed, hands clasped, his face a picture of indifference. There was something about his composure that made Stephen uneasy. Stephen moved towards him first. "Mr. Arden, I understand you were traveling with Mr. Blake. What can you tell me about his behavior today?" Mr. Arden raised an eyebrow but gave a polite smile. He was his usual self, no complaints, no concerns. Just the usual business dealings. "We weren't particularly close, if that's what you mean. Did he mention anything about anyone who might have wanted to harm him?" Stephen asked, his tone direct. Arden hesitated, just for a moment, before responding. "Not that I know of. Mr. Blake was a businessman, yes, but he kept his personal matters to himself. Always did." Stephen took note of the slight pause, but didn't press further. Arden's response was typical, someone trying to remain neutral, to distance himself from the deceased. But the fact that Blake had been a businessman, and Arden had no real insight into his life, struck Stephen as odd. He moved on to Mrs. Larkin, the elderly widow, and her son. They were sitting together, their faces painted with concern. Mrs. Larkin's hands trembled as she reached for her purse, and her son, though outwardly composed, kept glancing over at the door to the kitchen as though he couldn't wait to leave. "Mrs. Larkin, I'm sorry to trouble you, but I need to ask a few questions," Stephen said gently. Her eyes widened, and she nodded quickly. "Of course, Detective. Whatever you need. Do you know Mr. Blake? Were you acquainted with him in any way?" Mrs. Larkin hesitated. We weren't close, but we've traveled on trains like this before." He was polite, always seemed very focused on his work. She looked over at her son, who had been quietly watching Stephen. "I'm sorry, but I don't know if he had any enemies." Her son spoke for the first time. "None of us do. You'd have to ask someone who actually knew him. We're just passengers." Stephen studied them both. There was nothing remarkable in their responses, yet Stephen couldn't shake the feeling that they knew more than they were letting on. The son seemed more composed than someone whose companion had just been murdered, and that alone put Stephen on high alert. The Midnight Express continued its steady trek through the snow-covered mountains, its passage through the night an eerie reminder of the isolation that surrounded it. The coldness outside mirrored the tension within the train. Stephen Raul Hughes sat in a small, dimly lit compartment off the dining car, a cup of untouched coffee in front of him, his sharp eyes scanning the notes he had compiled. A sense of quiet urgency hung in the air as he pieced together the puzzle that had been thrust upon him. The murder of Samuel Blake was not random. The message found on the desk, "You'll pay for what you did. The truth is closer than you think," was too deliberate to be a mere threat. Someone had carefully planned this moment. But who? He was interrupted by a soft knock on the door. Without waiting for a response, the door creaked open, and the conductor stepped inside, his face pale, his hands wringing nervously. "Detective, I thought you should know," the conductor said, his voice shaky. "I've checked all the compartments. I found something." Stephen raised an eyebrow. "What is it?" The conductor reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. It was in Mr. Blake's coat pocket. "I wasn't sure what it meant, but I thought you should see it." Stephen took the note, unfolding it carefully. The handwriting was neat, but the words were cryptic. "The answers lie in the past. Uncover the truth or the shadows will claim you." Stephen's lips tightened into a thin line. Another message. Another warning. Where was Blake's coat found? Stephen asked, already standing up. "In his compartment. He was still wearing it when we found him," the conductor replied. "Was the coat removed before or after the murder?" Stephen asked sharply, already piecing together the inconsistencies. The conductor hesitated. "I don't know. I didn't think to ask." Stephen didn't give him a chance to respond. He moved past the conductor, heading toward Blake's compartment once again. He needed answers. He needed to understand who would go to such lengths to kill a man, and why. The compartment door was still ajar. Clara was sitting on the edge of the bed, her hands clasped tightly together. She looked up at Stephen as he entered, her face pale, eyes filled with worry. "Detective, you're back. What have you found?" she asked, her voice trembling. Stephen didn't answer her immediately. Instead, he moved towards the coat Blake had been wearing when he died, now draped over a nearby chair. He examined it closely, searching for anything out of place. As his fingers brushed against the fabric, he felt a faint bulge in one of the pockets. Reaching inside, he pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook. Clara looked at the notebook, her eyes widening. "What is that?" "I'm not sure yet," Stephen replied, flipping it open. Inside, the pages were filled with dense notes, names, and dates, neatly written, but cryptic. Some of the entries referred to people in the business world, but others were less clear. There were scattered references to meetings, deals, and a few mentions of hidden agendas and payments. Stephen paused on one particular entry, his finger tracing the words. "The Larkin deal is ready to go. Everything will fall into place soon. They have no idea what's coming." Stephen froze. The Larkins. He had spoken with Mrs. Larkin earlier, and her son, the one who had been so strangely composed. Could they be involved in this somehow? He closed the notebook and turned to Clara. "Do you know anyone by the name of Larkin?" Clara seemed to stiffen, her gaze drifting towards the door as though she might escape the question. I've heard the name, yes. But I don't know much about them." "Why?" Stephen's mind raced. The connection was becoming clearer, but the Larkins had been so quick to distance themselves from Blake's murder. The cryptic notes in Blake's notebook suggested more. There was something far more dangerous at play here than just a simple business deal gone wrong. "Do you know if Blake had any enemies on board?" Stephen asked, his voice calm but edged with a quiet intensity. "Anyone who might have wanted to hurt him?" Clara shifted uneasily. "No. Not that I know of. But he wasn't the kind of man who made friends easily. He kept to himself a lot." Stephen looked over at the door where the Larkins were sitting, deep in conversation. He needed to find out more about their connection to Blake. Whatever deal they were involved in, it wasn't just business, it was personal. Stephen left Clara to mull over the notebook. The wheels of the Midnight Express seemed to move slower now, the hours dragging on as if the train itself was conspiring to hold him hostage. Every moment brought him closer to something he wasn't sure he was ready to uncover. He stepped back into the dining car and approached the Larkins. Mrs. Larkin was seated at the table, her face a mask of concern, but Stephen noticed her fingers trembling around the stem of her wine glass. Her son, on the other hand, was staring at his shoes, as if lost in thought. "Mrs. Larkin," Stephen began, his voice steady, "I've just come across something that might be of interest to you. Your name, your family, seems to be connected to Mr. Blake's work." Mrs. Larkin blinked in surprise, her hand instinctively tightening around her glass. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice thick with unease. "I've found some notes in Blake's possession," Stephen said, his gaze unwavering. "They mention a deal, something with your family. Care to explain?" Her face paled. The composure she had been clinging to seemed to crumble in an instant. She opened her mouth, but before she could say a word, her son spoke up. "Mother, don't." He stood abruptly, his eyes meeting Stephen's with a look of defiance. "We didn't have anything to do with Blake. Whatever happened to him, it's not our fault." Stephen narrowed his eyes. There it was, the lie, so carefully concealed. The fear in his voice was palpable. The truth was just under the surface, and Stephen could feel it. "Tell me, Mr. Larkin," Stephen said, "what's your connection to Blake?" The young man stood there for a moment, unsure of whether to speak. His gaze darted nervously between his mother and Stephen before he finally spoke, his voice low and cautious. We had business dealings," he admitted, his tone faltering. "But it wasn't anything personal. It was just business." Stephen didn't believe him. There was more to this than just business. "Tell me everything," Stephen said, his voice sharp now. "Who else is involved in this deal? And what exactly are you hiding?" The silence that followed was thick with tension. Mrs. Larkin's face was drained of color, and her son refused to meet Stephen's gaze. Whatever they were involved in, whatever deal had been struck with Blake, it was dangerous, and it was about to explode. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but Stephen knew that the truth was still a long way from being uncovered. Someone on this train was lying, and it was up to him to dig through the web of deceit to expose them. The Midnight Express had slowed to a crawl, the rhythmic sound of the wheels over the tracks reverberating through the dimly lit corridor. The train was now heading into a stretch of wilderness, an isolated place where the snow fell thick and the night felt eternal. Stephen Raul Hughes stood in the hallway, his hand resting on the cold metal of the doorframe, his mind racing through the tangled web of deceit he had uncovered. The Larkins story didn't add up, and Samuel Blake's murder was far from simple. He turned back towards the dining car, his thoughts racing as he pieced together the evidence. There was a growing sense that everything on this train, the people, the circumstances, was connected in ways that went deeper than the surface. The Larkins were hiding something, and Blake's murder wasn't just an isolated incident. Whoever had killed him wanted something that had yet to be fully revealed. Stephen's instincts told him that the answers were hidden in the details, the smallest things that most people overlooked. Blake's cryptic notes, the Larkins' strange behavior, the quiet murmurs in the cabins, it was all part of a larger scheme. But what was it? As he walked back towards the dining car, he noticed something peculiar in the reflection of the window, a brief glint of metal from a coat pocket. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Stephen's trained eyes caught it immediately. It was too coincidental to ignore. He entered the dining car and made his way to where Mrs. Larkin and her son were still sitting, their conversation now hushed. Their eyes followed him as he approached, but this time, Stephen didn't sit down. He leaned in close, his gaze sharp and unrelenting. "Mr. Larkin," he said, his voice low, "I need you to explain something to me. When I was in your compartment earlier, I saw something that didn't sit right." The young man shifted in his seat, his face betraying his unease. He cleared his throat and tried to keep his voice steady. "What are you talking about, detective?" "I saw something in your coat pocket," Stephen continued, his voice firm. "Something that doesn't belong there. Something you didn't want anyone to see." Mr. Larkin's eyes darted to his mother, and for a split second, Stephen could see the fear in both their eyes. The truth was slipping away from them, and they knew it. Mrs. Larkin opened her mouth to speak, but Stephen held up a hand, silencing her. "I don't need a story, Mrs. Larkin," he said, his tone cold. "I need the truth. Your son has something in his possession. I suggest he tell me what it is before I do it the hard way." Mrs. Larkin's face turned ashen. She looked at her son with desperation, but the young man only looked at the ground, his hands clenched tightly in his lap. Stephen could see the internal struggle in his eyes. He wanted to protect his mother, but the weight of the situation was becoming too much to bear. "Detective," Mrs. Larkin said, her voice trembling, "there's no need for threats. I'll tell you what you want to know." She reached into her purse, pulling out a small, black envelope. "This was given to us by Samuel Blake," she confessed. "He said it contained important information about a deal we were involved in. Something that would change everything. We didn't know what to do with it. It was too dangerous." Stephen took the envelope, carefully inspecting it. The seal was broken, but it had been closed with such precision that it appeared untouched. He slid his finger under the flap and pulled out a folded piece of paper, the edges slightly crinkled from being handled so many times. Unfolding it, Stephen's eyes scanned the contents. The letter was brief, but its implications were far-reaching. The writing was hurried, as if the author had been in a rush. "The deal goes through tomorrow. Once the money is in place, it'll be too late to stop. They have their hands in everything, politics, medicine, law enforcement. No one will be safe. Destroy this letter if you value your life. Stephen's heart skipped a beat as the words sunk in. This wasn't just about money, it was about power. Someone, or a group of people, had orchestrated something far more insidious than he had imagined. They were pulling strings in multiple sectors, and Blake had been caught in the middle of it. Who else knows about this letter? Stephen asked, his voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. Mrs. Larkin's hands trembled as she spoke. No one, really. Samuel Blake told us to destroy it, but we couldn't. We couldn't get rid of it. It's too important. Where did you get the letter? Stephen pressed. Was Blake the only one involved in this? She hesitated, as though weighing the consequences of telling the truth. No, she finally admitted. There's someone else. Someone who's been helping us, someone who arranged the deal with Blake. Who? Stephen demanded, his patience thinning. But before Mrs. Larkin could answer, a voice interrupted them. Detective Hughes, may I speak with you? Stephen turned to find Clara standing by the doorway to the dining car. Her expression was unreadable, but there was an urgency in her posture. Something in her eyes told him that the situation was rapidly escalating. Clara? Stephen said, his tone questioning. What is it? I think I know who killed Samuel Blake, she said quietly, stepping closer. And I think I know why. Stephen's mind raced as he looked back at the Larkins, whose faces had turned a shade paler. Mrs. Larkin's trembling hands were clutching her glass tighter than before, while her son stared at Clara, his face now a mix of fear and confusion. Clara looked around, ensuring no one else could overhear them, before she spoke again. It wasn't just the Larkins, Detective. There's more to this than you realize. The people involved, well, they'll do anything to protect their interests. But I think Blake's death was a warning. A warning for who? Stephen asked, his eyes narrowing. For anyone who might try to expose them, Clara replied, her voice low but clear. And I think I know who's behind it all. Stephen's pulse quickened. He had been so close to unraveling the mystery. But now, the web was spinning faster than ever. Someone on this train was guilty of murder, and it was becoming increasingly clear that the truth would lead him down a path more dangerous than he had anticipated. Before he could ask another question, Clara spoke again, her voice barely a whisper. The real killer is someone who hasn't even been on your radar. Stephen's mind was spinning, his thoughts unraveling with each passing second. Clara's words hung in the air like a ghost, a whisper of something far more dangerous than a simple murder. The real killer wasn't even on his radar, and that was the most unsettling part. He turned back to the Larkins, whose nervous energy was palpable. Mrs. Larkin's hands trembled as she gripped the arm of her son's chair. Stephen knew there was more to this story, but the more he pushed, the deeper the hole seemed to get. Every piece of information he uncovered only led to more questions, and he was growing increasingly frustrated. Clara, Stephen said, his voice low, I need to know who you think is behind this. There's too much at stake now. Clara took a step closer, her eyes darting nervously towards the rest of the train's occupants. It's someone from your world, Detective, she said, her voice barely a murmur. Someone with power. Someone who's been pulling strings from the start. Stephen didn't need to ask further. He already had an inkling of who she was referring to. The shadowy figures lurking in the background, politicians, businessmen, people with ties to the highest echelons of society. It was all starting to fit together, but he was still missing a crucial piece of the puzzle. He glanced down at the envelope in his hand, the contents still fresh in his mind. The mention of a deal going through, the warning about the involvement of powerful individuals, everything pointed to a conspiracy much larger than a simple murder. Samuel Blake hadn't just been a casualty, he had been a warning, and whoever had orchestrated his death was far from finished. Who exactly is it? Stephen pressed. Who's behind this? Clara's gaze flickered towards the door, and for a moment, Stephen thought she might say something more. But before she could answer, a sudden, piercing scream cut through the stillness of the train. It was a woman's scream, high-pitched and filled with terror. The sound echoed through the narrow corridor, sending a ripple of fear through the passengers. Stephen's hand immediately went to the holster at his side, his instincts kicking in as he moved toward the source of the scream. He reached the compartment door just as it burst open, and a woman stumbled out, her face pale and her eyes wide with horror. It was Miss Larkin, the younger daughter, who had been staying in her own compartment just a few doors down. She was clutching her throat, her breath ragged. "They're coming," she gasped, her voice barely audible. "They're coming for us." Stephen's mind raced. The implication was clear, someone was already one step ahead of him. The killers weren't just playing defense anymore, they were on the offensive. Whoever was behind this conspiracy had just made their move, and Stephen had no choice but to act. He grabbed Miss Larkin by the shoulders, steadying her. "What happened? Who's coming for you?" She shook her head frantically, tears streaming down her face. "I saw him," she stammered. "I saw him in the hallway. The man, he's the one who did it. He's been here the whole time." The words were like a jolt of electricity. Who did you see?" Miss Larkin looked around the corridor, her eyes wild. She gasped for air, her words choking off. It was the conductor. The statement hit Stephen like a blow to the gut. The conductor? It didn't make sense. He had been present throughout the journey, a simple figure in the background, not someone Stephen had considered as a suspect. But now, with everything he knew, it felt like a piece of the puzzle was clicking into place. The train began to slow, its screeching brakes echoing through the cars, but it wasn't the stop that had Stephen's attention. It was the sickening realization that the clock was ticking. Whoever was behind this conspiracy had orchestrated everything so carefully, so methodically, that it was impossible to ignore any longer. The truth was out there, hidden in plain sight, but the players in this deadly game were moving too quickly for Stephen to keep up. He turned to Clara, who had moved closer, her expression a mixture of concern and dread. "We need to find him," he said, his voice steely. "We need to stop this before it's too late." Clara nodded, but there was something in her eyes, a flicker of hesitation. Stephen didn't have time to question it. The train had stopped now, and the passengers were murmuring nervously. The sense of danger was palpable, but Stephen knew that this was just the beginning. The conductor was the key, and it was time to find out why. As he started down the narrow corridor, his hand tightening around the revolver at his side, Stephen couldn't help but think of the words that had been haunting him throughout this case. "They're coming for us." The killer wasn't just someone lurking in the shadows. The killer was already here, and Stephen had to find him before anyone else died. He reached the end of the car, his eyes scanning for any sign of movement. And then, Just as he was about to push open the door leading to the engine compartment, he heard the faintest rustle behind him. He turned just in time to see the glint of a knife, the reflection of metal catching in the dim light. A shadow lunged at him. In the seconds that followed, everything went silent. Stephen's hand flew to his side, grabbing the handle of his revolver as he spun on his heel, meeting the attacker head-on. The struggle was brief but intense. The man was fast, but Stephen's experience in tight situations gave him the edge. With a swift movement, he disarmed the attacker, the knife clattering to the floor. Stephen looked down at the man, his breath coming in heavy gasps. The conductor's face was pale, and his eyes were wide with fear and desperation. There was no doubt now, he was the one behind it all. But as Stephen looked closer, he saw something that stopped him cold. The conductor's hands were trembling, and he wasn't just afraid. He was trapped. The web had been spun, but the real question now was who was pulling the strings. And Stephen was about to find out.
The facts are on the table, but the truth still hiding in plain sight. You've just heard Episode 1 of Detective S.R.H. Case 1-5, an original mystery written by me exclusively on Audible Archives. If you're hooked, like, comment, and subscribe. There are more clues, more crimes, and more cases yet to come. Until then, trust no one except your instincts. And so, the tale draws to a close, but the echoes remain here in the Audible Archives. And until our next journey through shadow and story, keep listening, keep wondering, because every ending hides another beginning. Audible Archives, where stories never sleep.